Thank you all for being here. My name is Amr Abdallah. I am the scholar in residence of the Baker Institute for Peace and Conflict Studies. It is my honor and the honor of my colleagues at the Institute to welcome all of you to this international symposium on the war in Ukraine, international perspectives, global perspectives. We are pleased with all the selection of the colleagues who will join us today, whether in person or in Zoom. And we look forward to a rich discussion and reflections, not only from the speakers, but also, of course, from the audience, whether in person or on Zoom. I think that will reflect the principles and values of participation and engagement that we adhere to at the Institute. We have, I think, a very significant program today, given the unique selection of our speakers. The program today will consist of two main panel discussions. One discussion will focus on the perspectives on the war in Ukraine from the Euro-Asian and European angle. And the second panel will focus on regional perspectives from Latin America, Africa, and Asia. We will, for each of the presentations or the panels, we will have one of our distinguished colleagues from Juniata College moderating the session, plus the speakers, whether in person or via Zoom. I will like to, and we will have, of course, between the two sessions, we will have a break. There will be coffee and tea outside. And we will plan to finish by 12:30. I encourage you to make use of this important event to engage and to share your perspectives and to ask questions of the speakers. It is, as we all know, the situation in Ukraine and that war is shifting by the day. I still remember, by the way, that when we were planning this activity and we were thinking to do it in November, my colleague Zia at that time had different expectations of where this conflict will be today. And actually, a week ago, I reminded him. And none of us thought that it will be where it is now. Let us hope that it will be in a better position tomorrow. And maybe with the contribution and knowledge that we will generate in this, that we can envision how peace can be achieved. I would like to invite my colleague and my boss, Dr. Zia al-Haq, to come and welcome all of you.
Thank you, Omar. Good morning. Thanks for being here. So I'm Zia Haq. I'm the director of the Baker Institute for Peace and Conflict Studies. The Baker Institute mission is to study warfare as human problems and peace as human potential. So in continuation of this mission, we apply the resources of the academic community to understand the unfolding dynamics of war that threaten global peace and security. As you probably know, that the Russian war against Ukraine continues to have a devastating impact on the people of Ukraine and their infrastructure and their livelihoods. So millions of Ukrainians were forced to flee and straining the humanitarian capacities in neighboring countries and also undermining the security of the region and also of the globe. So with the recent barrage of Russian missile strike and drones attacks on Ukrainians' civilian infrastructure, I cannot think of a better time to host these international symposiums on the Ukraine war, a global perspective. I'm extremely grateful to my colleagues, Dr. Amr Abdallah, Callan, my department's colleagues, Alison Fletcher, Henry, Dr. Jim Borgert, and Uma Ramakrishnan for the support and organization of this event. This morning, we have the honor to present 6 distinguished guest speakers from almost all continents of the world to bring their perspective, to help us understand what's happening in Ukraine and what are the global implications of the war. Please give them a round of applause and welcome to Juniata for sharing their time with us. I hope you will engage, ask questions, and enjoy the conversation. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Zia. So we're going to start with our first panel. And our moderator for the panel is Dr. David Chong, Professor of History at Juniata College. And our panelists are Dr. Anna Ohanian, Dr. Cecilia Van Pesky, who is joining us via Zoom, and Dr. Attila Uras, also joining us via Zoom. Dave.
Thanks, Amr. Okay, so the title of this panel is Euro-Asian Security and Environmental Perspectives, and we're going to get lots of other perspectives after the break with the second panel. Each person, just to let you know the setup for the panel, and Zoomers let you know as well, each person has 15 minutes to present. We will take questions not after each speaker, but after all of the speakers have presented. Zoomers, if you could put your questions in the chat, then our Zoom master will keep track of who's asking what and will read the questions so that those of you here in the room can hear the questions too. When we have the Q&A, I think there's going to be some mics that will get passed around so that the Zoomers can hear your questions. Okay. For those of you who have cell phones, if you could silence them, that would be great. And let me get started here. I'll just be brief with my intros. You can get lots of information about each of our speakers online and through the Baker website. So our first speaker is Dr. Anna Ohanian, Richard B. Finnegan Distinguished Professor of Political Science and International Relations at Stonehill College in Massachusetts. Dr. Ohanian.
Good morning, everyone. Thank you very much for the invitation, and it has been such a joy to be part of this community, even though I've been here only for literally a few hours, not even 24 hours. I've been so impressed by the work that is being done here and your normative commitment to peace. With this, and I do wish, obviously, that the circumstances are different. And what I would like to do, first I have to figure out how this works. Clearly, I messed up already. Maybe, okay, there it is. So what I would like to do within the time that I have, these are the points that I'll try to get to. Most likely, I'm not going to be able to get to, and we'll cover whatever is left in the Q&A. But basically, to talk about the general global and regional implications from this invasion. Specifically, I will focus on the Russian invasion in Ukraine, which is very different from the preceding years of the conflict that was building largely under the radar of the international law. So I will try to argue as to why this particular invasion is such a turning point, not only in the trajectory of this particular conflict, but also for the world security in general. I will also try to get to some of the existing primary and secondary drivers that exist as explanations within the literature of Russian foreign policy. If there is time, I will also touch on the imperial dimension of this conflict, which is actually quite, for myself actually, up until this invasion, I did not see this as an imperial conflict until President Putin finally, in his speech on February 24th, announcing the invasion, basically said point blank that this is an imperial war, and if you're Kazakhstan, you should be worried. Any other post-Soviet state that essentially, according to Putin, has been created out of the territories of the Russian Empire should be on the mark. That essentially was the aspirational component following from his speech. And what are the implications of ordering and disordering of the Eurasian continent? Before I get to all of these points, let me actually start by sharing something happened at home when the Russian invasion was happening. One of my teenagers, who is high school, seeing this support of Ukraine, it was covered so much, so extensively. There were signs everywhere in our town. In Massachusetts, I live in Concord, and she was actually frustrated and surprised. How come there is such support for the war in Ukraine, but there's not enough when the war in Yemen has been going on for so long, there was no such outcry. To which, on the one hand, yes, per year there are about 50 conflicts around the world, some more violent than others, human cost obviously significant in all cases. But what I try to tell her as to why this particular war is significant in terms of the implications that it is going to have on world security moving forward. And I apologize, I get carried away with the PowerPoint slide design, which did not allow me to expand the font size. So if you do not see the content, don't worry, you're not missing much. The slides are more to guide my talk than for you to see as to what's on the slides. So first of all, key components. This is a war of conquest. I mean, you might say that this is really obvious, but actually in reality, wars of conquest have nearly disappeared. Norms against conquest have been strengthening throughout the 20th century, and it's that norm against, the norms prohibiting changes of boundaries by force. It is that norm that has provided the relative stability in the world throughout the 20th century, not obviously factoring in World War I and World War II. So what we see, this particular war is significant because it is a blatant war of conquest, and in that respect, it was actually surprising to me, and many scholars as well, that Russia opted for this approach, particularly concerning that prior to that, the Kremlin was specifically trying to stay out of this explicit invasion scenario and was operating under the radar of international law, building, whether we're looking at the annexation in Crimea, which was quasi-legal, carried out through a referendum, or whether we're looking at Russian support of a deniable support of the conflict that Russia built in eastern Ukraine in Donbass. So I can't even, actually, I'm forgetting that I'm aging and I can't. The deepening of the existing regional fracture in Eastern Europe. The significance of this war is that now, since moving forward, regardless how the exit from this conflict will take place, now we have a militarized cleavage in Eastern Europe. This is a continent that was considered sort of that has succeeded and kind of tamed the demons of the war, with obviously the war in the Balkan Wars were shattering this image as well. But overall, European Union, European model of expansion, of interdependence was viewed as the regional resiliency. But of course, I actually, before this war, have argued that Europe, NATO, Euro-Atlantic engagement did make countries like Ukraine and Georgia into sitting ducks by creating a moral hazard for them, saying you are not part of this, you're not part of NATO, but at the same time you're not in, you're out, but you're kind of somewhere in between. And that really elevated, created the risk for them, security risk, in inviting the Russian attack. And in terms of so militarization of borders for the foreseeable future, the rupture of social and economic connectivity between Ukraine and Russia. There was deep societal connectivity across the region. And I think after this, also when you look back to the Russian Empire, even then, Russia, Ukraine, with all the nationalist rhetoric coming from Russia and periods of Russification that the Russian Empire has gone through in various of its peripheries before the rise of the Soviet Union, so there's quite deep connectivity. So this conflict, what my research finds, is that should not have happened, meaning that it was imposed, meaning geopolitical factors were really significant in bringing this about. Global economic instability that will result from this because of the norms of wars of conquest have been weakened. And we see while United States has been, if you recall, the invasion of Saddam Hussein to Kuwait, which was also a war of conquest, there was significant pushback by the United States and the coalition that it put together. This did not happen in the case of Ukraine, the main reason being that this is Russia. It's not Saddam Hussein. Russia is a nuclear power. And while the West provided significant military support to Ukraine, but there are no Western troops on the ground. So this, meaning that this really lowered the guardrail, the possibility for other smaller dictators, smaller autocrats, carrying out similar attacks in other regions. So in that respect, this really does create the possibility for similar wars of invasion. Right now, as we speak, similar scenarios being attempted to be carried out by Azerbaijan on Armenia's border, but there's pretty significant Western pushback on this. So these are really very difficult times. Interestingly, this was actually mind-boggling for me and many other scholars, that with this war, Putin really accelerated the slow decline of inside Russia as well as Russia's role in the Eurasian continent. Up until this war, I did think that Russia, working with China, would be able to actually carry out and advance this multipolar world order that Putin talks about, even though he envisions it as these regional blocs with few regional hegemons, essentially controlling spheres of influence. Countries like Armenia and Georgia and Azerbaijan would have to follow the lead of this hegemonic regionalist project, but still, I thought that could be something that would allow smaller states to grow within these types of blocs. But with this particular war, Russia actually also surprised China, I would argue, and became a liability. While China did benefit in a short term from the increased bargaining power it has relative to Russia in terms of access to resources, et cetera, but at the same time, weakened Russia is losing grip over its post-Soviet peripheries, and China is using the post-Soviet peripheries to connect to Europe in a much more effective way. So any hopes of Russia building this new alternative order are quite unrealistic, I would argue. In Russia, one of the arguments that I'll try to get to is as to how fascinating it is that Russia always has tried to do order building from top down, whether it's the Soviet Union, right, the Cold War, and kind of trying to ordering large, somewhat coercively, mixture of coercion and engagement. But at the end of the day, I think this top-down, it is the fabric of the Russian foreign policy has been, and I'm probably generalizing and being very ahistorical, this temptation of ordering from top down has been really, really significant. Let me move forward. I have only 5 minutes left. Essentially, what you see in this slide is the very long period of legal doctrines that supported the prohibition of war of conquest, dating back all the way to after World War I, where essentially non-recognition of territorial acquisition by force emerged as a tool to sanction against it. So in that respect, I think as we think about exits, the impossibility of recognizing Russia's annexed territories, and Ukraine is signaling that it is going to try to capture all of the territory, even though Ukrainian public seems to be split as to whether should Ukraine should acquiesce and take some territory and stop the war. Communities closer to the borderline are a lot more willing to compromise than the Western communities for obvious reasons. In terms of, let me just conclude simply by saying that there have been, within the academic scholarship, up until the war, which again, this Russian invasion is really clarifying as to where Russia is headed. But up until that war, some scholars have argued that Russia is a defensive power, that it's the United States, that it's the West that was Russia, whether it was the NATO expansion, creating fears of insecurity by Russia. That has been one argument, and essentially saying that there was no post-Cold War settlement of Europe, accommodating Russia in Europe. The second argument argues that actually, on the contrary, Russia is a revanchist power, that it is trying to challenge and undo the existing order, the liberal rules-based world order, no matter how weakened. And with this particular war, I'm inclined to think that Russia at least moved in that direction if it was not that kind of power before. And then the third narrative has to do domestically, that Russia is an isolationist power, that this particular largely irrational decision was a result of increasing domestic authoritarian decay. As such, external power is, external wars of adventurers essentially are used to justify regime stability, that this is a war of diversionary war. And I'll just simply conclude by citing a great historian, Stephen Kotkin from Princeton University, who has this really great article in Foreign Affairs titled 2016, titled Russia's Perpetual Geopolitics, arguing, predating Putin, throughout its history, Russia always resisted modernization from inside and compensating for the lack of modernization by engaging externally into all kinds of different types of warfare, and then really buying domestic legitimacy that way. I will stop here, but I look forward to any questions that might come from here. Thank you.
Woo! There, I'll let you know that Dr. Ohanyan has like another 7 slides, so there's plenty more that she has to offer, and I hope during Q&A you'll be able to tap some of that. Okay, next up we have zooming in from where?
Amsterdam.
Amsterdam. We have Commander Cecilia van Pesky, Commander of in the Royal Netherlands Navy, Netherlands Ministry of Defense. She's also involved with, she's Chief of Task Force Logistics, EU Common Security and Defense Policy. Okay? Commander van Pesky.
Oh, dear community at Juniata College and abroad, thank you very much for having me. Thank you very much for having me live in Huntingdon, which you did everything to make that possible. And then the plane broke down. The United Airlines plane broke down, as the organizers know. And that happened on Friday. And ever since, I'm trying to reach you. And I will still be trying to reach you. I'm booked for a flight tomorrow now. I mean, we'll be missing the symposium, but I'm hoping to still have a few days in Huntingdon to meet with you personally, because we have all been looking forward very much to that. So excuse me, we all tried. We were just not able to beat a broken airplane. But bringing me, in a way, that broken airplane brought me new insights as well. And I was speaking to the bus driver who shuttled me to my overnight stay here in Amsterdam, and he said, "This whole war," because he asked me, where are you flying? Where are you going? Symposium on the war in Ukraine. And he said, "This whole war is caused by the Americans, and they're all trying to let us think that it is the Russians." So this just brings me to a topic which I do find important in this speech as well. our whole world is in instability. Like, we are suffering from instability, not only in Russia, not only in Ukraine, not only in Europe, but in the whole world. So that's not a very happy message. And you see like, I'm not going to say that bus driver was right or wrong. I do think he tried to make sense of what he was seeing and hearing. And we do see that there's a lot of different opinions on what is happening at the moment. Thank you, Caitlin, for putting on my slides. It's going to be a bit difficult for me to say, like, let's switch to slide this or that. I'm just going to use these 15 minutes. Thank you for giving them to me. And feel free to go a bit through the slides, perhaps especially to those on EU and NATO viewpoints eventually, because then people can just watch the slides if they're interested. And then the verbal comments I can give Monday and Tuesday, when I hope to meet you all at the Bakery Institute and in the cafeteria, etc. We'll run into each other. So last time when I was at visiting Juniata College, I was there because I was invited to come as a fellow. I wasn't a commander in the Navy yet. That happened afterwards. I was a simple reservist in the armed forces. But I'm seeing specifically in this very masculine war that we're seeing now, and I'm using one of the different perspectives that you can take to look at this war, the geopolitical perspective, the geostrategic perspective, the political one, the historical one, the economical one, the social one, the one on human security, but definitely also the one on gender. And what we're seeing is that we're looking at a very masculine war, not a war of men, but of masculine values. The only soldiers we're seeing are men. The only politicians who are meddling in the story are men. Erdogan in Turkey, Putin in Moscow, Biden in the US, bigger players, the male president, prime minister, or chancellor of Germany. In a way, we can miss Angela Merkel, who was the female one before him, and she spoke Russian and she had contact with Putin because they both spoke Russian and had contact earlier in their lives as well when Putin was working in Germany. Remember, he was a KGB spy officer in Dresden in his early career. So there was a connection with Germany, and I think quite many years we've been able to use this connection to better the situation that we were almost running towards. And we're lacking such seasoned politicians, like very seasoned politicians, with also the ability to connect to Russia. The last one who still was Macron in France from Europe. And that connection has now been broken. He's not, as far as we know, he's not visiting Putin anymore. That brings us also to the topic of dialogue. Dialogue is so important. And I was asked to speak about the connection with the conflict and then the European continent, right? And for all our continents, it's important to have good dialogue with the Russian Federation. The US specifically hasn't had in the past. But in Europe, we have to, because Russia is our neighbor. And one of the effects of this conflict now is all those ties of dialogue are being broken, where those ties is what we need for the future, because there will be a future again after the conflict in Ukraine. And unfortunately, my very bleak prediction is that we will have decades and decades and generations to come to terms again to what has happened. This horrible traumatic event to everybody, war being back in Europe. So these dialogue ties have been broken. We used to have a program, and I'm sure many students have heard of it as well. It was called Erasmus Mundus, and then European students and also Russian students could engage in academic exchange. That has stopped after February this year. No Russian students are invited anymore to come and study in Europe. Nobody, of course, from Europe is going on vacation or holidays or like city trip to Russia. It was already a low number. You wouldn't find so very many people who had been, like if you would ask in the street, ordinary public, have you ever gone to Moscow for a city trip, would be hard to find these people. But now, of course, nobody is going. There's not even flights. There's not even buses. The only way now to go to Russia is to go to Istanbul and take a Turkish Airlines flight to Russia. Of course, you can still go from China. And then there is a bus line from Helsinki to Moscow, St. Petersburg or Moscow. That's the only option you're having. So it's very, very limited. Cultural exchange has stopped. Russian artists who were working in the Netherlands, now speaking for my own country, for example, painters and dancers in the ballet, they've all been turned back unless they have asked for political asylum. Academic programs also in the faculty exchange have stopped. There was a fear for stealing of important information, for example, from our technological field. And that's why academics have been dismissed from research programs and sent back to Russia. So this is affecting the connection between the Russian Federation and Europe at every stage. And I was now only mentioning aspects that we will also need for the future, right? But the more dangerous one for the present time, of course, are what is named in military terms hybrid warfare. All these aspects of making societies unstable that are anything besides open warfare, like shooting at each other or dropping bombs. Everything else we are seeing is happening at the moment. Our politics, European national politics, are being influenced by external parties, not only Russian Federation, of course, but external parties. That's what I'm mentioning it. Computer systems have been hacked and shut down for a few hours, or even sometimes for like 2 or 3 days. It has happened to our banking system, and it has also happened to our railroad system in the Netherlands. So we've had a day that you couldn't use the trains because the train system, the computer behind it, was down. These events have far-fetching influence on the people. Not only because there were people that, well, you can imagine that, right, couldn't go to the hospital because the train wasn't riding or had to cancel the wedding, but more importantly, people lose a feeling of trust in their own society. And if people lose trust in their own society and their politics, but also in all the services that the society provides, there's no money coming from the ATM and they can't take the train. This has devastating effects on the stability of these nations. I'm going a bit towards a closing statement. Time is short. I hope to speak further with you. As you can imagine, and also for those who have been in Europe recently, really basically on every street corner you see Ukrainian refugees. It's women and children. They're participating in public life, which is a good thing, right? They're trying to integrate. My personal belief is that many of them will stay because it will take many, many years, even before, it will take time before we can start thinking of rebuilding Ukraine. And if so, it takes years before Ukraine is rebuilt. And so we have to think of a way how to integrate Ukrainian citizens in our societies. And sorry that I don't have a more positive talk. There's positive sides as well. But what I think the difficulty will be the coming winter with energy supplies going really, really low, especially now also Nord Stream pipeline has been damaged. So what will the response of European citizens be towards this? And what will the Ukrainian Russian troops, what will they be doing? Will there be in a hibernation state, or will they just prepare for the final offense in the spring? So it's going to be hard and cold winter for many. Thank you very much. I'm eager to hear the rest of the symposium and very ready to engage with you today, and especially on Monday and Tuesday. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you very much, too. Stick around, because I'm sure there are going to be plenty of questions and comments. Okay, our third speaker, I hope we can get him up on the screen. Okay.
I think the slides are better than
Okay.
how.
All right. Our third speaker, Dr. Uras, is let me find my little thing here, a senior environmental expert who took part in some preliminary environmental assessments in Ukraine since June, since this summer. Okay, so Dr. Uras.
Thank you. Thank you very much. In fact, we missed beautiful slides, I just noticed. Yes, so first of all, thank you very much for getting me, making me a part of this panel. I'm very pleased to be virtually sitting next to the distinguished panelists, and I thank also the organizers for this great event. I was supposed to be in Ukraine as of last week. On the 11th, I had a train from Warsaw to Kiev for my third mission since June. But the bombings, the shellings on the 10th of October, especially in Kiev, changed the security situation dramatically, and I couldn't go. So I'm joining the event from Geneva today. I think I can take over and share my screen so that I can control the slides. So if you allow me, that will be, I think, easier. Okay. Yes. Apologies for that. I hope you can see my screen. Yes. Well, first of all, as we all know, the war is inherently destructive. And when you look at the past examples of the environmental assessments of armed conflict, it has been seen that the damage on the environment is really devastating on natural resources, on vital ecosystems, as well as the health, livelihoods, and the security of the people exposed to the conflict. And environmental impacts related work, which we can group under containment, mitigation, or remediation efforts, has to be an integrated part of both response and also the recovery actions. With reference to the past examples or the experiences of conflict or post-conflict related environmental assessments, when we look at the preliminary findings of the Ukraine conflict, it's extremely serious, very diverse, very much geographically spread, and not only in the east of the country that suffers most, but also in the central and western parts, which are indirectly affected by the war. I'm not going to read all of those. These are like, let's say, the preliminary findings, but it changes from scorched earth to mines in the forest areas, from soil contamination to destroyed wetlands, from dead dolphins due to sonar sounds to nuclear pollution risks. Additionally, the high risk of exposure of people is quite crucial, especially children, when they're exposed to toxic remnants of war, the chemical materials from bombs and destroyed industrial facilities, or other kinds of hazardous chemicals. This is really of utmost importance. Additional pressure is coming from the internally displaced people moving from the east to the western parts, sometimes causing 40 to 50% increase in local populations. That has a huge impact on basic services of the host communities, impacts on natural areas where they use the summer houses. So that makes the picture even more complex. And of course, there are challenges when you try to do the assessments, because to inform the future assessments, hopefully the post-conflict assessments in the near future, hopefully, there's a need for comprehensive and extensive field assessments because we need to determine the character, the scale, and the significance of the impacts, environmental impacts, and also the remediation requirements. It's crucial to feed the recovery efforts to ensure an environmentally sustainable reconstruction when the time comes. Such assessments will require, of course, at first, remote sensing or satellite imagery, which then has to be matched with extensive ground truthing, which additionally requires sampling and analysis, And this needs to also take place in the areas that are inaccessible now due to the ongoing clashes. Also, the challenges go beyond the current, let's say, status. The assessment work has to cover a wide range of issues that will include the impacts on nature, on the human-related issues, the health, safety, of course, the biodiversity that's feeding the crucial ecosystems. The urban centers dimension is very crucial. There are very much destroyed areas around with hazardous debris, which we will talk in a moment. The agricultural production facilities, not only for Ukraine itself, but it is in fact becoming a global food security issue. The chemical plants, fuel metallurgical industries, which may have impact even transboundary, looking at the borders and all the rivers that are, for example, reaching the Black Sea, etc. So there's a transboundary component. The waste and treatment facilities, these are all impacting also terrestrial and freshwater systems, and also coastal and marine ecosystems environments. But I mean, looking at this whole picture, even only the initial monitoring work shows that the country and also the region risk being burdened with a legacy, a toxic legacy, long after the conflict ends. Well, just to show you, in fact, the ongoing efforts, because there are so many actors involved in the environmental assessments in Ukraine. OCHA, the UN's Office for Coordination of Humanitarian Affairs, is chairing a working group in Ukraine with around 80, 90 members representing more than 50 institutes of UN agencies, governmental, non-governmental organizations, think tanks, individual experts. And it provides also an online hub on diverse information and links to various environmental assessments. So it is in fact a good crowd of people. It is quite crowded, but it's a good crowd, bringing many different assessments, many different layers of assessments, in fact, for the use of the whoever is interested, but also as a decision support tool, which requires some level of coordination because it's a bit of widespread. Because it is assessment, it includes assessments from air quality to nuclear risks, from destroyed infrastructure maps to impacted agricultural land or storage facilities. But there's one challenge. Almost all these assessments are carried out by remote sensing techniques, as well as geographically tagging some social media and national media news. So there's a strong need for validation and information and data coming from the ground, which makes, of course, the role of the State Environmental Inspectorate of Ukraine very crucial. They have still a very strong network, but it requires a lot of effort to validate this information for the future use. The Ukrainian government wants to have cases for compensation in the future, for example. Let me quickly take you through the different dimensions of the environmental impacts. One of them being the chemical pollution. The release of toxic industrial chemicals is quite significant. There are at least 7 confirmed incidents of toxic industrial chemicals caused by military activities. And since the beginning of the conflict, oil refineries, the entire oil and gas processing sector has been damaged, which is, of course, bad for the storage, but also creating a lot of pollution problems on soil, on surface water, on groundwater systems. When we look at the waste, it is another huge issue. In fact, all of these items could be presentations on their own, could be term-long courses on their own. When we look at the waste sector, the most important threat is probably linked to the nuclear waste. Just one example is at the beginning of the conflict, Russian Federation took control of the Chernobyl nuclear power plant and other nuclear facilities in the exclusion zone. And the movement of the military vehicles caused dispersion of dust, leading to an increase in background radiation. Additionally, there has been numerous shelling around facilities that deal with radioactive wastes, as well as research facilities which own nuclear fuel assemblies. But perhaps the most recent and the most important one has been the shelling of the big nuclear power plant in Zaporizhzhia, one of the largest in the world and largest in Europe. And UN Secretary General called for international inspectors to be given access to the nuclear power plant, and just underlined that any attack to such a plant is a suicidal thing. And unfortunately, the risk is still valid. And another dimension of the waste issue is, as I mentioned earlier, the large-scale displacement of people to the western Ukraine that causes huge waste generation, and also lacking fuel does not allow the municipalities to provide waste management services. The other impact is on the urban areas, because we know since the beginning, starting not only on the eastern part, even around Kiev, there has been significant damage to buildings, to municipal infrastructure, railways, airports, administration buildings, educational facilities, and that causes huge debris in the cities and towns, and asbestos is likely to be present in the debris, given the widespread use of the asbestos in building materials since the Soviet times, and infrastructure also in Ukraine, with the estimates of 60% in roofing materials, 60% use of asbestos in roofing materials. That will require quite careful consideration in future assessments in the recovery and also the reconstruction plans. When it comes to, of course, the infrastructure, damaged infrastructure, just the last 10 days, 30% of the power stations of Ukraine has been damaged, and now there are regular power cuts in almost all the cities, including Kiev. Well, one important issue is the food insecurity, because agricultural sector in Ukraine is the main drivers of the national economy, and Ukraine hosts 25% of world's reserves of black soil. Problems in Ukraine have impacts on Sahel, on different parts of Africa. So agricultural land has been affected by three types of damage: physical degradation, pollution by chemical pollution, and affected industries. So these are creating huge problems in Ukraine and also beyond. And also the grain storage facilities have become targets of bombings. Now the grain corridor is open, but it's still not at the levels to export the all restored grain in the country. And finally, the nature is a big victim, I would say, of the conflict in Ukraine. 20% of all nature conservation areas have been affected in the country. Nearly 1 million hectares of protected areas have been impacted, in another word. And there are also some reports of deliberate killing of animals, mainly farm animals. And also, as I mentioned, a very unexpected, I would say, impact has been reported deaths of several thousands of dolphins in the Black Sea over 3-4 months' time at the beginning because of the use of the sonars in the naval processes. Well, I have, I think, less than 5 minutes, very quickly looking at what's going to be in the recovery plan. There's an environmental recovery and development plan, which is an integral part of the national recovery plan, with ambitious targets under grouped under these 9 reforms. But in summary, the aim is to build back better and to build back green. And also, as Ukraine is now in the EU accession process, which will take perhaps decades, but still it's another trigger to push the Ukrainian government, and they are willing to do that, for an environmentally sustainable and also climate resilient reconstruction. So what is next? Well, Ukraine is a totally different ballgame because many of the assessments in different parts of conflict-affected states in the world are post-conflict, but this conflict is going on. So there's a need for continuous monitoring of the impacts and hoping and wishing that the war is going to end soon. The recovery and reconstruction plan has to be informed by scientifically solid, comprehensive, multifaceted environmental impact assessments. And these assessments should consider all aspects of physical and social environment, including nature, biodiversity, exposure and public health risks, and complex socioeconomic and demographic factors, because when it comes to reconstruction, things may go on a fast track. Environment could be accepted as something nice to have, but not fully integrated. But we have quite promising discussions with government authorities in Ukraine that they are willing to keep environment as part of their reconstruction because they know that their economy also fully relies on natural resources linked to agriculture. I will stop here. There are many references that you can use. There are many assessments, but the main thing that we hope is that the war is over and we deal with a post-conflict assessment to feed a proper reconstruction and redevelopment of Ukraine. Thank you very much. I will be available for any questions you might have. Thank you.
Wow. Okay, so we've had a variety of perspectives from Russia, Russian leadership. Commander Van Pesky has brought in some civilian perspectives. Dr. Uras has brought in the non-human world, both living and non-living. We have short-term perspectives that have been presented, things that are going on right now. We have the long-term historical perspective that Dr. Ohanian has provided about Russia. We have the long-term perspective of possible recovery, both human, societal, and non-human. So there is a great deal for us to talk about, and I thank the presenters for each of them coming in under their time allotment, which gives us plenty of time to explore the issues that you're interested in. So I think of myself as the air traffic controller who is going to manage the questions, both here in the room and on Zoom. I would like to privilege students first because at Juniata, students come first. And I'd also like to, if possible, privilege Zoomers who have questions for Dr. Ohanian because during the break, she's not going to be on Zoom to be able to take your questions. We will keep the Zoom running during the break, so you on Zoom can continue discussing with each other, but also if Dr. Uras and Commander Van Pesky can stay on the Zoom, that would be great to be able to field questions from other people on Zoom or people in the room. If you want to go to the UFO here, that's our mic, that would be great. But, of course, Commander Van Pesky and Dr. Uras, you deserve a break too. So if you need to step away from the Zoom during the coffee break, please feel free to do so. Okay, so we have mics for in the room. So let's perhaps start with someone in the room, and then we'll go to a Zoom question. Okay, so we have a question here. If you could keep your questions relatively brief,
okay.
And if respondents could keep their comments relatively brief, then that will allow us to get through more questions and cover more ground. We have plenty of time, so please, if you could introduce yourself and then please go ahead.
Okay. Hi, everyone. I am Elijah Weaver, and my question is for Dr. Ohanian. I was wondering what you talked about first when you were talking about like how your daughter talked about why are people talking about Ukraine but not Yemen? And I was just wondering, like, to what extent do you think that social trends in social media and peace building are prejudiced or preferential?
That's a very important question to ask for several reasons. On the one hand, I fully agree and that I think some wars do not get the coverage that they deserve. And in general, I think if I speak only from the perspective of the United States, where I have more firsthand exposure, international news are not dominant. People do not think about the world in ways that they should. Only 9/11 was the only factor that all of a sudden kind of made people realize that conflicts are not sort of safely tucked away and they can have global projections. But I think and it is unfortunate that I think the media it plays a hugely important role, and there's several problems with the way the media is covering some of this conflict. So on the one hand, the Yemen conflict obviously did not receive the coverage that it needed, particularly considering the vast devastation of that conflict. So that's number one problem. As I mentioned in my comments, I do think that this conflict is structurally, strategically very, very different, because it is going to reorder the world. Hopefully there will be some order building happening after this. This continent is, in contrast, if you think about the African continent, Latin America, this continent is the one that is still stuck on imperial competition, neo-imperial competition. So while we hoped that we would move to the multipolar world order where regional powers, Turkey, Russia, for example, China would take regional ownership, and they would move into these stable and developmental regions coexisting peacefully and will live happily ever after. That's not what's happening. The continent is divided by new imperial competition, and if we're not able to tame those trends, and Ukraine is really a critical conflict to that end. But since we're talking about the media, another problem with the coverage of the war, not just this war, is this both sidism. There is, New York Times actually is very guilty of this too. There is this sort of one-sided narrative. While this is a very clear sort of a black and white conflict, but at the same time, I think there has to be a lot more granular approach to describing the conflict. Both sidism sometimes takes the pressure off the aggressor, not so much in the Ukraine conflict, actually, for other conflicts as well. So I think the media has a huge role to play, and I honestly am probably, this is my opinion, but I don't think media is sensitive enough to understand how should conflicts be covered. What is the moral center of the media? Just trying to be objective does not necessarily mean you lose moral compass in the way you cover a particular conflict. So I will stop here. I hope that answers your question. Great question.
Thank you so much.
Commander Van Pesky or Dr. Uras, do you want to jump in on that question, or Dr. Ohanian's response? Okay, Dr. Uras, go ahead.
No, I was just confirming that I have nothing to add.
Okay, all right. I understand that there is a, oh, I'm sorry. Thank you. Cecilia.
No, just the question is so important. Why, right? And Dr. Ohanian has already answered, but I think the one point is very important. This is really going to shift our whole world, the outcome of this conflict, and also how we're going to deal with, even if there's going to be a ceasefire soon, how are we going to deal with the fact that we had this conflict that's really going to change the world. I think the conflict that comes closest is the one in Afghanistan. Very different, but totally not resolved. 20 years there, we left. There is no resolution to what has happened there. And it, of course, also was a big influence East-West. I don't want to just only say America, Russia, but there was a lot at play between this bipolar East-West dynamics. And it's the same now with the conflict in eastern Ukraine. It's too shallow to, nobody said, but it's too shallow to say, oh, it's because they're also Christians and white and they look like us. It is part of it, but that's not the whole thing. It's the extent of it, plus I think the collective shock, especially here in Europe, seeing what is happening. Collective shock that war is back. And we see it in our own wallets and in the gas prices and in our instability of our politics. Yemen, for example, doesn't have that effect on Europe. Libya doesn't have that effect on Europe. It has if the pipelines are not secure. It has if there is a further influx of refugees from Northern Africa, Maghreb. But it doesn't have to any extent as what is now happening in Ukraine. So that's the major reason why I feel it's getting so much attention, and it also, of course, should get so much.
Okay. Dr. Maru, please, welcome. We're delighted that you can join us. Please add your insights.
Yes, thank you so much. And I want, since this is the first time I'm speaking, and I want to thank you, all of you at Becker Institute for inviting me. Just I want to steer a little bit the discussion by adding a few points on what Dr. Onan has said and others have commented on. And just, I understand the geopolitics and the interest aspect is important in this kind of the attention that is given, the resource and the attention given by different countries. Geopolitical importance is important, as we have said, as it has been said in the case of Yemen, for example. But let me give you one current ongoing genocide in Ethiopia, the war in Ethiopia, and the special advisor on prevention of genocide at the UN has already highlighted, the Secretary General has highlighted, a UN commission has highlighted about atrocity that is ongoing. More than 500,000 people have died in the past 2 years in Ethiopia. More than 500,000. The attention is not even the fraction that it deserves. And how many of us, even in the academia, know about this? I think it is serious question on the overall, not only humanity in general, but the structure of multilateral organizations, how they prioritize their agenda, and also how they react to different. I believe elements of racism play a role, no question. It's inbuilt in the system and the structure. I'll bring these pointers in my presentation later on. But I think it's very important in the academia, at least. Human rights values are so important. When institutions are devoid of those values, they will again and again fail, like they failed before in our the history of human being, the institutions of multilateral. I will highlight later in my presentation how Africa is reacting to Ukraine and why that is the case, even on referendums of annexation. We should have been universally rejected, but a majority of African countries are reacted in very, very weird, even to me, in terms of voting behavior. So I will come back to this point later on, but I just wanted to interject at this point.
Terrific. Stay tuned, folks, for the second panel. I understand that there is a Baker Institute person managing the chat and is going to present chat questions. Perhaps we could hear from that, a question from the chat.
Hi, yeah. We have a question from Etta Albright. If the United States is going to be instrumental toward rebuilding post-war, oh no, sorry, wrong. Here's the question. In regard to the commentary submitted, is there a concentrated effort appealing to the people of Russia and the world for the collaboration and cooperation to dispel the fear of dominant powers through violence and destruction?
Okay, presenters, do you want to hear that question again, or does someone want, Dr. Ohan, you want to hear it again? Okay, could you, Amelia, could you give us the question again?
Sure. In regard to the commentary submitted, is there a concentrated effort appealing to the people of Russia and the world for the collaboration and cooperation to dispel the fear of dominant powers through violence and destruction.
Dr. Ohanian, you want to take a swing at that? Yeah. All right.
I think that's an important question. Public diplomacy is the key word here. So one of the challenges as to why it's difficult to exercise public diplomacy in this case is because very often, and I don't want to generalize, these types of wars tend to be carried out by deeply authoritarian states because authoritarianism, militarization, centralization of power, they all go hand in hand. And Russia has experienced a significant breakdown, decline. It was a relatively open democratic society under President Yeltsin in the 1990s, but there has been a steady decline in authoritarianism. Right now, the Kremlin controls all of the levers of public discourse inside Russia, which makes it very difficult to get messaging in. So that's number one as to why it's difficult to reach Russian society. So propaganda is a powerful tool, and actually I was talking to some of the students yesterday about this. So that's number one. Number two, I think Russian society, and I'm generalizing again, is described usually as a conformist. And like political culture is a very difficult thing to study and measure, but in general, public protest, there were attempts at the beginning of the war, there were anti-war protests happening in Russia, right at the beginning, but the heavy-handed use of force really dispelled it. This last wave of mobilization, many thought, and Putin has been delaying it, there is a reason as to why he's not calling this a war, but calls it a military operation in order to prevent for the war to seep into Russian discourse. But even with the mobilization, which he called partial mobilization, he was afraid that there would be protests against this. What has happened, many Russians have left. Actually, there are a lot of Russians moving to post-Soviet states. I was in Armenia this summer, and the presence of Russians in the streets is noticeable. So that also took the pressure off. But in general, I think I don't have a good answer as to how in these conditions, when protest activity is not happening, public messaging is very difficult, how do you get, there's a lot of, this war is not popular. Nationalist voices, pro-war voices are a lot more visible because the Kremlin is surrounded, is listening in to the security apparatus, to sort of the security voices. But in general, this is not a popular war. Crimea annexation gave Putin a very big boost. But this war is really not popular, but those voices are not heard. One last point, I love the work of Erica Chenoweth, who has argued, and Maria Stefan, who has argued that effective nonviolent disobedience, going back to Gandhi, going back to Martin Luther King, that strategically nonviolent protest is more effective, and that if societies mobilize 3% of the population, they'll be able to overwhelm the security forces of the state. In Russia, we saw there were several cities there were anti-war protests, but the numbers still significant, but for a population of 140, there just was not enough. So the big question is why Russians do not come out in bigger numbers. And if they did come out in bigger numbers, I do think they would have overwhelmed the security forces. I don't want to minimize the risks of protesting in Russia, but I think that's the challenge.
Any other of the panelists want to address that question? Okay, do we have a question from here? Do we have the mic?
Sorry, one back here.
Got it. If you could introduce yourself, and please go ahead.
Oh, geez, that's a lot of people. Hi, I'm Riley. My question is specifically for Dr. Uras. How likely is it that the environmental factors that we want to see implemented after everything is calmed down is likely to happen? Because, as I'm sure we all know, developing and redeveloping nations are very unlikely to be environmentally friendly as the rebuilding is happening.
Dr. Uras, were you able to hear Riley's question okay?
Sure, yes, I heard. I mean, I heard 80% of it, but it's, if I understand correctly, it's about the reconstruction, how to ensure that it is environmentally sustainable. Well, usually you get this, let's say, indicators whether there is this willingness to take environmental issues into consideration seriously. A major reference is the communications with the government counterparts. In addition to the strong civil society in Ukraine, well, many different UN organizations have been invited by the Ukrainian authorities to carry out different levels of assessments linked to natural resources and also linked to environmental issues. This is quite rare to find, especially when a conflict is going on. The initial requests to multiple UN agencies came even in early March. So they, even before the EU accession process started, there was an interesting critical mass of requests coming from those authorities to carry out assessments, to make sure that these damage on the environmental places or different components of the environmental, let's say, sector are registered correctly. They ask for improved capacities of the inspectors of the State Environmental Inspectorate to make sure that for example, the soil samplings or any assessment are carried out in the best scientific methods available. They ask for the review of their approved national assessment systems. So these are like signs that they really take it seriously. And as the, let's say, a big component of the national economy relies on agriculture, and on the other hand, their track record of environment was not that good because of all the old technology industrial facilities, especially on the eastern sides. They really wanted to have probably a clean page when the time comes for the reconstruction. If you look at the environmental recovery plan, it's a very comprehensive, a huge, sometimes I call it like a wish list, but it has almost everything in it. So these are very good signs. Of course, it's not going to be easy, that's for sure. But these are very good signs for UN agencies, for the European Union institutes, and also for the civil society to use for their future advocacy and lobbying work when the time comes for planning and implementing the recovery and reconstruction. So I really want to keep positive hopes for that. Thank you.
Terrific. Amelia, do you have another question from the chat that you can offer? Oh, I'm sorry. All right. Please, Commander Van Pesky.
Yeah, just very, I'm not the environmental issues expert, especially not as my distinguished colleague speaker, but as many of you know, I've lived in Ukraine for many years, working for the OSCE. And what I was always struck by is that there was already a really well-established lobby in Ukraine on protection of the natural habitat. I remember Ukraine used to have a lot of forest, steppe forest, but forest was already under great threat. And it was they had very harsh rules on illegal wood chopping for your own fireplace in your house. I witnessed often that people who had just like a few buckets of wood that they got from the forest, that they were fined very heavily for doing so. So this was not the wild, wild west without any rules. There was a lot of comprehension in Ukraine that it was important to safeguard your habitat. And I've always felt personally more effective. Like the Ukrainians, of course, they are not the little farmers that Russia wants them to depict them as, simple folks who are just simple farmers. But they do live very close to nature, much more than the average Dutch person, much more than the average European. And may I say so, also quite much more than city folks, let's say, in the US. They are very aware of processes of growth, of the growth of the sunflowers, the corn, the rye, the watermelons that we are seeing now in the ads of the Ukrainian armed forces, they had the Black Earth, remember? Chernozem it's called, which was so very, very good soil, and that needs to be protected because it's also getting depleted. I think one of the big problems, as far as I can see, is this problem with the asbestos. The asbestos is everywhere in Ukraine, and it's everywhere in a country like Georgia, for example, as well. It was massively used during Soviet times for any type of constructions, farmhouses, stables, houses, governmental buildings. And this is a huge problem, which I have no answer to. But the Ukrainians themselves, I feel, are very sensitive for their natural habitat, and that's a good thing.
Terrific. Thank you. And I apologize for not seeing your hand waving. It just shows that it takes a village to moderate a discussion. So please continue helping me out. Okay, Amelia, do you have another question from the chat, please?
Yeah, we have one more, another one from Etta Albright. While the focus is on the dynamics of actual war, don't you think it's time we openly embrace the powers behind the motivation, pitting the us against them mentality?
Okay, I'll open that up to anyone on the panel who'd like to address that. Commander Van Pesky.
But I would like to let my colleagues, but this is such a good question, just like the other questions are very good, but this is such a good question, because what's happening, I cannot say mainly in Europe, I haven't been much in African countries lately, but in Europe, it's such demonization of the Russian citizens. It's like, it's really, really bad, and it comes from lack of understanding of the situation, lack of having context with Russia. Like I already said, nobody in the Russian Federation, obviously, but already in the past, I never met, it was so difficult to find people who speak Russian, have been to Russia, studied in Russia. In the military where I'm now, the only Russian speakers that are there, they don't tell you that they're speaking Russian because there's a special reason why they speak Russian. But I know that they're in very limited numbers. We don't have many. And all the other military in European armies have never been to Russia because they were not allowed to, because of their position, right? So it's pure demonization. People don't understand how Russians think. And from the other side, I would say it's the same, right? When I worked in Donetsk, in the Donbass, of course, I heard many horrible stories about how we are in the West and how, like Europe, and how Americans are, and that we molest children and, et cetera, et cetera. So it's like, because we don't cooperate together or have exposure to each other, things are going really wrong. And I know the Baker Institute has always been a huge proponent of bringing people together and offering that opportunity for dialogue. Just one thing, maybe as an example for any of you who's interested in that. I mentioned this before when I was at Juniata. There's a very interesting peace project in Israel. It's called the Peace School, where they bring people together, Israeli and Palestinian citizens, to break through these stereotypes, because they're in a similar situation, demonization of the other in the nation. So we know that there are examples, like may they be short, like little, of how many people they affect. But I'm always thinking, why can't we on the bigger level? And we will need it, people. We will need it, because we will have generations of traumatized people in Russia and in Ukraine.
Anyone else on the panel want to address that question?
I'll add something super quickly and from a different angle. The quantitative studies on armed conflict actually demonstrate this very fascinating trend that war as a military tool to achieve goals is increasingly ineffective. And some scholars describe this the evolution of non-victory, meaning that the obviously, this Russia, when it comes to Russia, it's always difficult to see to what extent this is a specific case, it's a unique case, to what extent this is like a typical authoritarian state that is engaged in warfare, to what extent the peace process around the Donetsk in the eastern Donbass region broke down, and could have, whether that, if that peace process was given a chance, whether that would have averted the war. But I think this notion that evolution of non-victory, that neither Russia, both Russia and Ukraine actually end up losing quite differently from this war. At the strategic level of the conversation, I think that's going to require a different process. Obviously, we would all want for negotiated settlement. And the politics surrounding it is very difficult. But I think when it comes to dialogue groups, I think we know enough that promoting cross-conflict connectivity, those are all important. But we also have to be cognizant that those types of things, the spillover is very limited. And I would argue that down the road, reviving the economic connectivity between Russia and Ukraine is going to deliver the biggest boost in recreating, salvaging some of the connectivity that existed between the societies. They're intermarriages. I mean, these communities are deeply, deeply intertwined. So I think working towards opening borders, recreating economic ties is going to be necessary, but at the same time, the critics would say there's a lot of economic interdependence between the two countries, and there was not a guarantee that we did not prevent the war. But still, I think that remains a necessary tool, I would argue.
Okay, we have a question right here. Again, if you could introduce yourself, that'd be great.
All right. I'm Julian Padula. I am a politics student. I was wondering, Commander Van Pesky, if you've met any of the men who have been fleeing from Russia to avoid the military service, and like how they are received in other countries, and like if they're like being given like assistance to like integrate into those societies, or if they're like trying to be like shooed out of the countries that they arrive in. Like, what is it like for them to be received?
Commander Van Pesky, could you hear that question well enough?
Yes. Not all of it. It's about military, how they are being received and how they're being reintegrated in society. But which military?
I'm sorry. The men fleeing Russia. Like, how are to like?
So are you talking about civilian refugees rather than military?
Yes, the ones avoiding military service.
Okay, the Russians avoiding military service.
Yes, I'm sorry for being unclear.
Yeah, there are many layers to this. Actually, can I will get to this question, but one thing, because what Anna Ohalian said, Dr. Ohalian, also all research shows this. Old-fashioned type of warfare is not bringing us peace. We've seen this. In next year, in 2023, we will be commemorating 75 years UN peacekeeping. For sure, Baker Institute will also have some activities on that, and we're organizing activities here in the Netherlands as well. But we're not saying we're celebrating that, because we're getting less and less UN peacekeeping because it's not effective as it has been. We know parts of it are effective, but we need to find different ways. And what is in a way very scary at the moment, that European armies and other armies are only boosting up their armies. The German army government has donated or allocated 100 billion euros to their armed forces. This is incredible. These are amounts that we can't even fathom how much money this is. This is also money that is taken away from energy transition that we need, from environmental protection, from any green deals for the future, or progressive peace for the future. We're going backwards. We're going back types of wars that had 100 years ago. And even though I'm in the Navy now, which I'm doing with all, very big motivation and very consciously, I'm also doing that because I'm seeing it's important that I also voice another voice, right? That people hear something else also than only the old-fashioned type of war. At the other hand, I also understand that when things go really bad, and they could still go very bad. For Ukraine, it is already very bad, but also for Europe, that we have to have something like well-trained and well-prepared armies, because if we don't have, then so we have to be prepared for the worst, but at the same time develop parallels for peaceful settlement and negotiation. I think in the Netherlands, so to the next question, in Europe and in the Netherlands, we're having hardly any men who are trying to evade being drafted for the army in Ukraine or in Russia, because they just can't enter. The women and the children came. The only men I've seen are either like handicapped or invalid or just sick, for example, and they couldn't fight. Georgia is one of the last countries that's having a free visa policy for Russians. So Georgia is the last country is having them. I was in Georgia in July last time I was there. I'm usually there twice a year. It's swarmed with young, bright, progressive, healthy, well-educated Russians. So just also to give you that description, many of them working in IT, so they can just do their job wherever they need to. Some of them even told me, my boss, like they had a boss in the US or in India or whatever, doesn't even know where I am. They don't know that I left Russia. I can just do work from my computer. I'm now just doing my work during the night because of time difference, where I used to do it during the day, things like this. But they were young and basically integrating quite well in Georgian society. Now it's a much bigger number. Now it's really those who also are in their 30s, 40s, and 50s even, trying to evade being drafted to the front. That's a different story, and you can really see that for the small nation of Georgia, with only 4.2 million inhabitants, it's very difficult to have that great influx, but also how to deal with them. And at the border between Georgia and Russia, there were people standing there demonstrating with big banners saying, "You're not welcome here. We expect you to go and demonstrate to your own government. Tell them that they're doing wrong. Don't just come here and don't demonstrate. You have to make the change in your country." That's very deep. You understand, right? It's very deep emotional values, very deep.
Great. Dr. Ohanian also has some thoughts.
Great comments from Commander Van Pesky, simply to add the political risks that these Russian emigres create for the state where they're moving. So these are Russian citizens. And this whole war in Ukraine is justified in the Kremlin as Russia protecting the Russians in Ukraine. So the scenario of securitizing the Russian minorities in post-Soviet states is a scenario, it's there. I'm not saying that the Russians will do it, but the fact that you have so many Russians, in Georgia it has been a lot more contentious. The numbers have been more, between Armenia and Georgia have been more or less the same, but there were two waves. In Armenia, where I essentially observed them, there was a big wave of families really moving right after the war when it started, mostly from the IT sector. They were able to move their businesses because they could not access they could not carry out financial transactions, etc. So there was a lot of Russians who moved because of that. But after this last mobilization, men, that I have not observed on the streets. But the danger that it creates for the state is that these are political ticking bombs, if I could put it this way. Down the road, this creates a stress on the states because, number one, there could have been spies that have infiltrated to keep track on these individuals from the Kremlin. Number two, if Russia wanted to pressure these states, it could have created all kinds of legal, political challenges for them. And it really puts the governments in the middle because there are also now anti-Russia protests in some of these countries, and the governments, both Georgia and Armenia, do not want to be so explicit against the Kremlin. So they're sort of right in the middle. It really creates a push for on these governments to speak up much more than they have.
Okay, we have one more question. Sorry.
Absolutely, and it's, we're just about to the end of our time, so this will be the last official question in this time period, but we have the coffee break for you to continue on the discussion. If you could introduce yourself?
Yeah. Hi, I'm Eva. I'm an exchange student from France. I have a question especially regarding the European foreign and security policy, so it might be a question for Commander Van Peske again. You mentioned that there are a lot of Russian civilians that had to come back, especially painters, dancers, and I don't understand like what was the strategy of the European foreign security policy about that. Like, why wasn't there the possibility to ask for a political asylum or something for those people who were working in countries of Europe, especially? I don't know if my question is clear. Yeah.
Merci beaucoup, Eva. Je vous en prie. It's a complicated question as well. I didn't fully get it, but I think you are interested in European security, right? And that is a good thing. So it was a bit in my slides as well, but we didn't have time for everything. But let's look each other Monday and Tuesday when I'm in Huntington, Eva, so I can give you more answers. There were two major, at the EU level, two major documents, and there was one on the Dutch level, major document, this February till March. First one was the EU Compass, which is it's the new compass for the EU security. The other one was the NATO strategic direction document. So a renewal of NATO interference, NATO approaches when it comes to security, also so for all NATO members, and therefore also for Europe, because most NATO members are European, where, of course, the strongest one is non-European, because that's the US. But besides to that, a new defense policy on the Dutch for the Netherlands national level. Other European countries might also have had this year. They're dependent on when were elections held. And of course, the Dutch national defense notion also directed more financial resources to boosting up the armed forces, but also very much towards inter-European cooperation, and specifically with Germany and Sweden. That's the major allies for the Netherlands. It's not France, not your country, Eva, because we are having difficult misunderstandings or misinterpretations about the use of submarines. You have a big submarine industry, and my nation has it well. So it's competition. And competition is a very bad thing at the moment between European nations, industrial competition and political competition, because we still should stand as one. That is very clear. We are standing quite as one, but not fully. The fact of that we have had Brexit, of course, is a very, very big threat in all this as well. You can see that Britain is in many different ways trying to hook on to Europe when it comes to security strategy. I myself at the moment am the director of a military mobility office in Germany, where I'm not telling you any secrets here. I wouldn't be able to, but you can also read it. Basically, like how can we make sure that the European ports are strong? And then in this case, the Dutch ports. We have 3 major seaports going out on the Atlantic. We all know people that when things go really bad, that's the ports of embarkation, the ports where the entry ports where American personnel and material will arrive through NATO forces if they need to come to Europe. And they are already coming in much bigger numbers, and they will move through Germany towards the Polish border, through Poland and to the Baltic states. Also a bit more southern, Romania, Bulgaria. So this is actually what is happening at the moment. And what is the most important, like overall in this context, is, and it's my opinion, but and also not everybody will agree, but Europe is in the middle of this, in between these 2 big powers, West and East. we don't have full consensus amongst our members. But definitely we need to make sure that we're not depending on others when it comes to our security in Europe. So I am very much in favor of boosting European security. And that means having better prepared armed forces, but also more resilience in the overall population. Very important. Preparing people for what might happen. I'm in favor of working on having a European army. So not national armies, but a European army. With the European history, with what happened in the Second World War, of course, this is difficult to achieve because we have all kinds of elements installed to make sure we don't have one strong force army in Europe. But now the times have changed and we do need it. And personally, my prediction would be we will have a European army, or let's call it a European Schengen army, military Schengen, but we don't have it yet. But it will. Everything that's happening now will give a great boost to it, and I will always fight for it. That this is a peaceful army, an army like the UN peacekeeping forces for the Blue Helmets. That we have a peacekeeping army in Europe that really is of serious substance, and that can really help boost security in Europe and in the countries around it.
Okay, well, we are at the bottom of the hour, so that brings a close to this first panel. Let me turn it over to Dr. Abdullah to take us on to the next step.
Well, thank you so much, Dave, for your excellent moderation of this session. And thanks to all the great speakers and all the colleagues who had those excellent comments and questions. Indeed, I feel very enriched with more information and knowledge about this entire topic and the different dimensions. And I'm looking forward for the next session at 11 o'clock. It is time for our coffee and tea break. It is being served outside. So let's take about 25-minute break, and we will be back at 11 o'clock sharp. Thank you all so much. Thank you. Okay, great. Welcome back, everyone. And again, thank you so much to our speakers of the first panel and the moderator, and to your excellent engagement and the depth of your questions and also the responses. Now we are shifting to our next session, where the focus will be on the regional perspectives on this war in Ukraine. And will lead us into this, our moderator, Dr. Donna Weimer, the Thornberry Professor of Communication at Juniata College, joined by a distinguished panel composed of Professor Juan Carlos Sainz-Burgo, Professor Mehari Maro on Zoom, and Professor Swaran Singh. Donna.
Welcome back, everyone, and welcome to our friends on Zoom. So glad that we are able to bring this and to record it and to have it so that we can go back and share it at a later date. As he said, I'm a professor of communication, so it's very hard for me not to listen to this morning and be absolutely overwhelmed by a kaleidoscope of words that kept reoccurring, and some new ones that I learned from our panelists, right? Whether it's wanton destruction, rivals, allies, annexation. Someone mentioned a new world order. We talked about colonialism. We talked about China a little bit, neighbors, what it means across the country to, especially in Europe and Asia, and how it's impacting them. And our next set of panelists will really be talking about regional perspectives. So if you're not close by, how is this war affecting us in Africa and India and in all the other countries that are deeply affected, and I would include the United States, which encourages us here at Juniata to really listen globally, but also locally, to really become aware of what it's doing talk to some of our international students, and you will get a deep sense of the impact on what it costs to heat their homes this summer in France and the worries about the coming winter. We heard a lot about the winter that's going to be coming up and how difficult and hard it's going to be. So think about what questions you want to ask. Think about using these words, these speakers, as opportunities, wonderful opportunities to ask any kind of question, because what we want to do is continue to make connections. The more we understand, the more likely we are to be in a position to want to do something, to want to make a difference, and to want to care. So it is with great pleasure that I'm going to ask two of our panelists to, if they wouldn't mind sitting up front. Dr. Maru is on Zoom, and he will be speaking second. So I am very eager to hear from our guests. We're going to begin with Dr. Juan Carlos Sanz Borgo, who is the Dean of the United Nations mandated University of Peace. He is a professor for international law and international relations. Please help me welcome him.
Good morning, everyone. Thank you very much for the invitation and for the opportunity to be here. I will have use of the microphone because it's such an interesting conversation that we have in the first panel. I would like just to recover the first line of the presentation of Anna, that as I was kindly introduced, I'm a lawyer and a political scientist, but I think I'm more lawyer than a political scientist. And Anna started her presentation with the idea of the war of conquest. The war of conquest is the key issue to understand from the legal point of view this conflict. I just want deviation from what I want to talk about Latin America later on. The system that emerged after the Second World War with the United Nations completely prohibit that. It's not possible. We don't talk about the occupied territories in Palestine because you know it's fun to call it in that way, because basically the United Nations, the system prohibit the annexation of Israel of that part of the land. So remember that this war in Ukraine is the second part of the annexation of Crimea some years ago. So basically that's the point, and if we see it in a historical perspective, remember that after the First World War, when we create, or the United Nations create the League of Nations, basically construct a system that try to prohibit this kind of conduct. So the League of Nations fails basically because it couldn't stop the annexation of Manchukuo by Japan into the Chinese mainland, and also of the invasion of Italy into the Ethiopia. So that when the League of Nations was not able to stop that situation, everything collapsed. And also another of the element that was brought by Anna earlier on, the argument of the Nazi Germany say, we need to protect the Germans in other lands, and the rights start to develop and to incorporate land. In this moment, we ended up in the Second World War. So I just want to take that historical perspective also from the point of view of international law, because I think it's absolutely fundamental, and that's why all the wars that are happening, answering your daughter, Yemen is not the same, because nobody in Yemen is trying to incorporate no neighboring countries. It's an internal conflict. And of course, we had plenty of internal conflict around the world, but with the exception of Armenia and Azerbaijan and the Nagorno-Karabakh area, there's very, very few discussions about international borders today. That actually was a great success of the system after the Second World War, with the exception of this, old-fashioned 19th century conflict in Europe. That's it was the deviation as a lawyer in this talk. So, going back of what you asked me to talk about the regional perspective, I would like to start with the idea that you asked me to talk about the Latin American view. And of course, when we talk about Latin America, we talk about America. America is quite a concept to define, because if you ask any members of the continent from Argentina to the Caribbean, Central America, say, what is America? We'll tell you the whole continent. But clearly in the United States, it's just with the perspective of the US. And this is one of these funny discussions that we are all Americans, but of course there is no word that can define the citizens of the United States. So when we talk about Latin America, it's more or less the same. What is Latin America? I mean, it's super difficult to define. South America is a little bit easier because it's, it's something that goes south of Mexico. Even it's a huge discussion if Mexico is part of South America or not. But Latin America is a concept that for some authors include the Caribbean islands, for other countries that do not include the Caribbean islands. So the task to talk about Latin America is extremely complex for different point of view. So I will talk about Latin America in the strict sense of it. So basically the main countries in South America, not including the Caribbean in this discussion. So covered the issue of the definition and the complexities around. We have to say that Latin America, even though I'm from Venezuela, I love Latin America, I love salsa, I love tacos, I love everything in my culture, we are a peripheric area. I mean, clearly we're a peripheric in many sense. For example, from the economic point of view, we are just only ahead of Australia. All the big regions of the world are bigger in economic terms, but also when we compare with Russia, we need to do that comparison. Russia, in economic terms, is the same as Italy, without pasta, of course. I mean, when you compare Italy and Russia, has the same scale in economic terms, but of course they have nuclear weapons, and does give, the position on the world politics. But also in the size, is very important to measure a little bit to put everything on perspective, because the size of Latin America is about 19 millions of kilometers square, about 7 million square miles. And when you compare with Russia, only with Russia, we're talking about 6 millions of square miles, or around 70 million. So the whole subcontinent of Latin America is almost the same as Russia. So, when we think this, we have this problem with the Mercator projection that we never understand exactly what is the size of the world. In a more political terms, until the 90s, last century until the 90s, in Latin America was a discussion of dictatorship versus democracy, backed by the whole discussion of the Cold War and the support of the United States foreign policy of some dictatorship as an excuse to fight against communism. And that's why, we have some dictatorships in America that have the American support, because basically we're trying to stop the expansion of the Soviet Union at that time. That discourse disappears. Right now is a fully democratic region where the discussion is not democracy against dictatorship, is a more complex discussion between left and right. And this left and right discussion is so important in this discussion, because for many people, as we discussed last night, for many people, Putin represents the old Soviet world. For some leaders in Latin America, Putin represents the old communist dream. That, of course, is not correct. I mean, Putin is today more far right than any other people, but that helps some hinges to understand Latin America. In this moment, the democracy in the region goes from extreme right to extreme left. Okay, we have everything that you can imagine. If we go to the extreme right, we will see Bolsonaro. That is kind of a Trump brasileiro. I mean, Trump with samba. Is a former military guy that, goes. He also followed President Trump on the idea that you can cure COVID, drinking whatever you want to drink. That was from that side. And also we have a millennial guy that is the president of Salvador, Mr. Bukele, that actually adopt Bitcoin as the national currency, because we need to modernize the country, so et cetera, and say he decided to adopt the Bitcoin as a national currency. So in the middle, you have such a collection of people, very nice, very interesting. For example, the new president of Chile that actually belongs to the Communist Party. He belongs to the Communist, he believes in the Marxist society, but he believes in democracy at the same time. And he has been one have attacked directly Putin, saying, no, this is illegal, this is an invasion, it's unacceptable, even though he comes from the Communist Party. Then we have, for example, the president of Colombia, that is a former guerrilla commander. He was the commander of the M19, one of the most important guerrilla movements in the last century, that went to pacification, and now is the president elected in Colombia, trying to promote the peace process. So when we go left and left, we ended up in a very complicated figures at the far right, the far left, sorry, that is Maduro and Ortega in Venezuela and Nicaragua, both elected by elections not recognized by the international community, but elected in that sense. So I need that explanation in order to give you how we divide the positions of the country in relation with the conflict. I will follow Professor Jose Antonio Sanauja, he's an alumni of UPs, and about the classification of the country. He divided in four groups. One group of countries that, with no doubt, condemn the invasion. Say, no discussion, this is an illegal invasion, forget about it, we will not discuss it. That is the majority of the countries, basically the Dominican Republic, Costa Rica, Ecuador, Peru, Chile, etc., etc. There are two very important countries that try to appear internationally as neutrals and said, no, this is a very complex situation. That is basically the two biggest economies in South America, Brazil and Argentina, who say, no, that's not that bad. I mean, this is a European conflict, etc. But they condemn at the Organization of American States and at the United Nations the invasion. So the rhetoric one on one side, by the support against the invasion was on the other side. The third group, there is only one country, is El Salvador, with the president Bukele, with the idea of this Bitcoin, et cetera, even though he's very far right, the United States have been very critical of the government, not supporting his policy. So in order to bother the United States, President Bukele decided not to condemn directly the invasion and play the neutrality. Even though he does not support the invasion, he's not condemning international basically as a way to be outside of the consensus in the region. And last but not least, we have 4 states that do not condemn and actually support the invasion, support Putin's position on the war in Ukraine, that basically are Cuba, Venezuela, Nicaragua, and Bolivia. That basically they take the discourse that is the fall of the United States. They join the driver of commander and about that is everything fall of the United States, and that is the far left of the continent. But why that situation? Why we have that variety of positions? So basically, there are some elements that I would like to go. First of all, a great expansion of the Russian foreign policy in the region. Believe it or not, the Sputnik vaccine of the Russians arrived first in the majority of these countries that are supporting right now. And so they are paying back the favor. Okay, I received the Sputnik vaccine. I have to support you because it's very important during the pandemic. Also, for Argentina and Brazil, more than 60% of the fertilizers that they use in the huge agricultural industry comes from Russia, and it's very, very important. And last but not least, the financial support that Russia provides to these countries that always have an economic situation. But why we have this expansion of Russia there? Basically for a retreat, very conservative, you can name it in different ways, of the American foreign policy. The American foreign policy only sees the region from a security point of view, with basically the issue of migration is on the top of the agenda, leaving the region for something only provided of migrants, leaving this concept that in a second level. It has been an area abandoned by the American foreign policy for many decades, and this is a result of that. I mean, if you abandon an area, you will have new actors on that one. And a part of Russia, clearly China. China is, the new actor, providing all the economic support and, is the new power. So to conclude on some regards about this, first of all, we can see that there is a huge lack of consensus on the region around this. The topic is perceived as an European conflict, something that these people are fighting, that will not affect what happened in Latin America. They will not affect the relation between the United States and Latin America. So it's an European problem. Let's leave it at that. In the case of the regional agenda, the local agenda supersedes the global agenda. For Latin Americans, it's more important our own discussion between democracy and freedom, left and right, than what happened in Russia and in Ukraine. So for us, something that we watch on the news, that we discuss, and then you will have your own opinion based on your own political assumptions. So if you belong to the left, you will say something. If you belong to the right, you will say it wherever. Even though these different approaches into the conflict, the different positions, no country in Latin America has changed their relations with Russia. No break of diplomatic relations. The imposition of sanctions has been very complicated. Well, let's not do it by New York. We can do it somewhere else. So it's a very, very, how we call it, practical approach. Again, it's an European conflict. Who cares? Let's manage the problem from our own point of view. And clearly, to conclude, there is no homogeneous or clear response to the war. It's based on our own regional agendas. That's what I would like to point out there about the Latin American response. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much. Our next speaker is actually on Zoom, and this is Dr. Mahari Maru, who is professor at the School of Transnational Governance at the European University Institute in Florence, Italy. He is a fellow at the United Nations, the University Institute on Comparative Regional Integration Studies. Please help me welcome Dr. Maru.
Thank you so much for this kind introduction, and also let me thank Becker Institute for inviting me again. And I will follow what my colleague Joan has said earlier on the fact that I am also more of a lawyer than any other profession as such. And it gives a lot of emphasis on norms in general and how important they are. And I will talk a little bit about that. But my talk first, again, to use the caveat that when we talk about Africa, it's not about a country. It's not a country. Africa is a coming together of 55 countries with 17% of the global population, 1 billion and more, and but with a little economic impact, if you wish, in terms of economic capacity. It's only 3% of the global economy, for now at least. There are a lot of opportunities with the population growth and the sheer size of Africa, and it attracts a lot of interest, but still in terms of its place in the global power politics or economy, it's very, very limited. My presentation will be focused on mainly on the impact of the Ukraine war or the Russian invasion of Ukraine on the economy, especially food security, as Africa faces significant number of population that are affected by famine, drought, food shortage in general, and the fact that food security relates also to a large extent with water security, which is related to climate change. And we have heard in the morning session about climate change, environment in general, and the kind of disasters that we have. I will talk about that a little bit. And then the second one on the geopolitics, the competition of great powers. I think many have mentioned Africa has been a battleground when global powers, global strategic interests are at play on competition basis, basically great powers competition and even middle powers expanding their influence, their business, including in military terms, but also in other kind of economic activities. And this affects the third point I want to talk about: war and conflicts, including coup d'etats, the resurrection of coup d'etats in Africa, and how the Russian elements also play into that, as well as the Western world also trying to play through its proxies in Africa. And the impact of all of this on multilateral organization, multilateralism in general, is visible. If there is one place where it is extremely visible, apart from the UN Security Council, where you have veto power, Russia and China, it is Africa's voting behavior in the UN Security Council, but also especially in the UN General Assembly. And I will come back to that point later on. If you can take us to the second slide, there are figures clear on food security, mainly access to fertilizers and the issue of grains, access to grain. There are many African countries that are heavily dependent on wheat imports from Ukraine and Russia and Belarus. In addition, of course, we have fertilizers also, the supply of fertilizers, very important as agrarian community in Africa. Many of the countries are agricultural based economies, and the lack or the delay in supply would affect significantly the economy, the food security in general, the cultivation process, and so on. Because they are also dependent on rain-fed agriculture. So there is a limited window of supply time. So there are significant fears because of this increase in price. There is inflation in the economy, and this means you could have riots, which we call bread riots. And Professor Amir Abdallah knows a lot about this in Egypt, in Sudan, and elsewhere. This is, it could be a serious political crisis, if you wish. In some cases, historically, we have seen governments being toppled because of crisis related to food and especially the availability of bread. Next slide. And then I think the climate change has a big role to play. The reason is simply Africa, as we speak, has 146 million of its population going hungry every day and facing starvation and different levels of famine. Not IPC, in terms of IPC 5 level and starvation, we have more than 1 million as we speak. And these are acute starvation levels. And as a result, because this didn't happen just yesterday when Ukraine was invaded, it happened, this food insecurity has been there for some time. Countries are also trying to use their capability to produce more food using irrigation, and at the same time also to secure themselves in terms of energy. Let's not forget Africa is a continent of 700 million population. It's 700 million population doesn't have access to electricity. So there is a lot of effort, both in the private sector, but in the public sector, to make sure that countries are using all sources of energy, including water, hydro energy. And Ethiopia, for example, has built the biggest dam, which has caused dispute on transboundary management of the Nile River with Sudan and Egypt. So a confluence of this all has added to the fragility of many African states. And I have said earlier, that this is leading to the third point I want to raise about the geopolitical competition. And this is an important element in many ways. If you see the voting behavior recently, we have witnessed serious problem. The last one, I'm sure some of you have followed, more than 76% of the countries in Africa have had a problem in terms of deciding how to deal with the Russian invasion of Ukraine, which should not have been the case, given that Africa is a victim of imperial and at the same time artificial borders that are imposed by colonialism. And the fact that borders, there was a decision by the OAU, the Organization of African Unity, long time ago in Cairo, that colonial borders remain untouchable. There was a decision so that to avoid conflicts that come or emanate from disputes on border. There was a decision that they should remain untouchable, and until now that is the case, and many countries have subscribed to that at the state, but still we have a lot of course, conflicts on border. The recent one between Ethiopia and Eritrea, which is continuing until now, it is part of that we see in Ethiopia, huge atrocity happening, huge army, according to some estimates, very reputed institutions estimate more than 1 million troops are involved in the war in Tigray now as we speak. Earlier, I have mentioned there are many aspects of this war that affect the livelihood of many people who are facing starvation and food insecurity. If I can get to the next slide. Of the latest one, 19 of the 25 countries that has abstained in the UN General Assembly on the referendum in the annexed areas of Ukraine or parts of Ukraine, 19 of the 25 countries are Africa. And abstention in this context could mean basically abandoning the core principles of the UN and even to that extent Africa's its own charter. And there were considerations, of course, national consideration, national interest consideration that play, both access to supplies of food, grains, but also military armaments, access to military armaments from Russia and others. There are Wagner and other entities are also operating. You have, I'm sure you follow that. In the Sahel region, especially the belt of Sahel, we had several successive coup d'etats, in some cases, coup d'etats against the coup d'etat in Burkina Faso recently, that the involvement, the way the coup authors narrate their mission is tied up with the Russian role of the Russia in this situation, but also basically detaching, at least normatively in propaganda style, detaching themselves from colonial countries like France, in the case of Mali and other countries in the Sahel region. And we see it also in the voting behavior of Russia and China, where even African countries saying that there should be more robust intervention in the war on Tigray, as I have spoken earlier, which is costing more than 500,000 lives have been claimed in this war. And the attention is not there. But the African continent requested the UN Security Council to take some measures, but it's not happening. Of course, within African countries too, there is significant difference. And this, in my opinion, is a serious challenge to the multilateral world order that emerged after the Second World War, and African countries having a lot of vote in the UN system, though it's not like the UN Security Council, which is the the custodian of, even if you wish, the world order as such, with all its privileges. And we know Africa doesn't have a permanent seat there, even if there are requests for that. And there was a very surprising pronouncement by President Biden that Africa should be considered to have a permanent seat there in his last General Assembly speech. But still, the impact on the normative framework is serious. And it's a big challenge, in my opinion. And there are other aspects that I will bring later on in our conversation, in exchange, question and answer. But I think suffice to say that the great power competition is affecting significantly Africa's ability to have policy sovereignty, even the idea to access normal market supplies, wheat and fertilizer, which are critical for Africa in terms of food security. And also, equally, the shift from African conflicts, wars that need a lot of attention from the international community, including on COVID, on locust plagues, on drought and famine that we are facing with hundreds of millions in starvation. It is a serious, serious implication on the continent. And the way Africa is responding is not really something unified, and it's not dynamic as such. It is sometimes in the non-aligned countries style, but in other cases, especially those that are facing coup d'etats and unconstitutional change of government, they are leading there. I can give you an example. Eritrean region in Ethiopia, which is part of the war on Tigray in Ethiopia, it has openly supported the Russian annexation, even the referendum recently, and also even Taiwan's, the visit by policy to Taiwan, and its opposition, open opposition to that kind of visits in support of China. And there are emerging elements in addition to the coup d'etat authors. But we have also even regimes that stayed for a long time, even if they are considered authoritarian in many ways, but trying to use this crisis to increase their leverage, either to access resource or to pronounce themselves in terms of normative frameworks. I'll end here, and later on, if there are some points that I want to bring in the question and answer, I'll pause them. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Maru. Our next and final speaker is Dr. Singh, professor from the School of International Studies at Nehru University, New Delhi, India. He's a visiting professor right now at the University of British Columbia in Vancouver, Canada, and says the weather's not too bad there. So please help me welcome Dr. Singh.
Thank you, Donna. Thank you, Amr. Thank you, Zia. Thank you, Caitlin. And thank you to the team of a very prestigious Baker Institution and colleagues at Department of Peace and Conflict Studies. And to the entire Juniata community, I wouldn't have known how unique and great this institution is if I had not visited here. So luckily my flights worked and I'm here. Thank you for all of you for being here with us today. You will notice that I'm going to be speaking on Ukraine war from Asian perspective, and I'm already introduced. What I'm going to do in my next 15 minutes is to look at what Ukraine war is doing to international relations theory. This happens when technology decides to play fool with you, and if you transfer it on email, sometimes slides go haywire. So what it means for international relations theory, again from Asian perspective, what it means for actual international relations or affairs, and then of course what it means for Asian nations, particularly big and small Asian nations, and then, of course, finally looking at India's perspective to close my discussion. And the first one on international relations theory, you heard Dr. Maru also mentioned this being primarily great powers contestation or major powers contest. Now, difficulty is that in international relations theory, the positivist mainstream realism, for example, believes that major powers will always be in contestation because of international system being perceived as anarchy. Now, that international system is dynamic, and therefore they also believe that whereas the status quo powers over period will decline, there will be new ascendant aspirant major powers. And that makes the dynamics little more complex than a simple contestation. What makes it still more interesting is also the fact that status quo declining powers are often anxiety prone, are impatient, compared to ascendant aspiring states being far more cautious and far more patient. And therefore, you can see that we live in a world where we still assume Russia and United States to be those status quo great powers who are on decline, and I include United States. The discussion on relative decline on United States is almost now 2 decades old. It's a gradual decline. Ascendant aspirant states, and since I come from Asia, would be countries like China and India. And you can see Ukraine war again is showcasing their behavior in a certain fashion. For international relations theory, I think it's again interesting to see how there are lessons. Ukraine, when it separated from Soviet Union or Russia, was the 3rd largest nuclear weapon state. It, of course, gave up those nuclear weapons. Now, what are the lessons of Ukraine war? Where you see a country called North Korea with limited number of weapons can make US president travel twice to Asia to shake hand with that dictator. Does it mean that now it's also going to give a lesson that countries should actually pursue nuclear weapons far more seriously than they have done so far? Lessons to Iran are very significant. It could also mean definition of what makes a country powerful also open for discussion, because when Germany and Japan became great economic success stories, they were not seen as great powers, whereas China, when China becomes an economic success, is seen as a great power. Simply because we live in a very different era, when the total focus on military power has moved away to Joseph Nye's works about soft power, diffusion of power, smart power, sharp power. Power itself is very differently defined. And of course, unlike Japan and West Germany, who were kind of partners of United States or junior partners of United States, China is seen as a challenge. So what makes a country power and enter that major powers club itself is very interesting way it is defined. Another theory which is popular in international relations is democratic peace theory. You could go back to Thomas Paine or Immanuel Kant, or more recently to Michael Dellon or David Singer. The basic belief is that democracies are usually reluctant to initiate wars. Now, are we saying then that Ukraine is not a democracy or Russia is not a democracy? The point I'm making here is now we are in an era of a huge, diverse types of democracies. And amongst them, you are hearing now of majoritarian democracies, let me say authoritarian democracies. What that means to this basic theory in international relations that believes democracies are less inclined to go to war. Then, of course, the very institution of war, which is at the center of international relations. War on one end, peace on the other. I heard in the morning, war, Zia said, is something which is a problem, and peace is something which has to be worked upon. It applies to all of us on everyday life. But in international relations, war until about 18th century, before Industrial Revolution, was largely mercenaries-led. and soldiers fought for profits. And then, of course, industrial revolution resulted in standing armies being created, because you could create that kind of armies in peace times as well. You could pay them salaries, equip them with weapons, give them residences. It seems we are reverting back to 18th century is what Ukraine teaches us. Because before that, Iraq war saw US using almost 100,000 soldiers from private security companies who were not part of the state. They were part of profit-making private companies. And now in Ukraine, we have gone a step further. We call them volunteers. They are not even representing any legally registered companies. You could just be someone who loves, shooting targets of human beings. You could be a sniper. You could go there, and therefore we now talk of what is proxy plus war, where Ukraine, in my limited understanding, would not have withstood more than 7 days against Russia, thanks to what I call proxy plus war, supported by West. So it's a contest between West, led by United States, divided house a great extent. I know the range of opinions that European countries hold and how much they are supporting United States in that fight. But enormous amount of money being devoted, resources, defense equipment, weapons, information warfare, cyber warfare, legal warfare, propaganda warfare, and snipers. I don't want to name countries. I am traveling between two which have sent a lot of them. So that kind of contestation has very little to do with Ukraine, which is devastated. So it's a 20th century war. It's not a 21st century war. It's a 20th century war. And therefore, war itself is getting redefined. And we are now reaching a point where volunteers could go and do things the way they want. And that central institution that was ultimate instrument of protecting national sovereignty itself is getting into confusion. Military-industrial complex, I need to move little fast forward, is another interesting area to look at how actual affairs on the ground are happening. 5 top nations, Russia, actually United States 30% itself, plus Russia and plus France, Israel. 5 top exporters export 77% of total weapons around the world. India is now claiming certain share of 0.2% of exports, mostly non-lethal. Now, military-industrial complex around the world has enormous power to decide that countries should continue to kill each other, because they make profits out of it. They have enormous endowments, various places, of course. They also promote, all kinds of social welfare activities. But why it is a simple question that none of the terrorist organizations around the world are having any dearth of weapons ever. No terrorist organization has closed down, we have no weapons anymore. So even the non-state actors get access to weapons produced in some of the most developed nations. So how does military-industrial complex decides that wars will continue and Russia and Ukraine will continue to fight? Good recent examples, $4.5 billion sanctioned to support exporting weapons from US to Eastern Europe, $2 billion for Pakistan, $2 billion for another country, I forget. So military-industrial complex deciding countries will or will not fight, which countries will fight, with what weapons. Battlefields are also often exhibition grounds. Iraq war raised exports of weapons from United States enormously because it was seen as a success. Russia's weapons are not going to be sellable now. Most countries, depending on Russia, will have to now think of shrinking, buying Russian technologies. More specific everyday life, food, fuel, fertilizers shortages. Sri Lanka, in India's neighborhood, this summer for about 3 months had absolutely no government functioning. Because of this food, fuel, fertilizer shortage, 30% of food grain exports are from Belarus and Ukraine and Russia. But Russia is the largest energy supplier around the world. So that kind of disruption is making politics really, really impossible in many of the countries. Very quickly, Asian perspectives. Putin has enormous support in Asia. Many people don't realize that because what you live in a place where we are doing, sort of anti-Russian propaganda we are reading all the time. Collective Security Treaty Organization, 10 members are with him, as much with him as Europeans are with the United States. Then, of course, he recently went to attend Shanghai Cooperation Organization. 15 other countries are there with Putin, at least accepting him to come in and sit and talk with him. That kind of support, particularly China and India. China has actually shot up purchase of fuel. India has also raised purchase of fuel. Two countries where Putin had visited before this Ukraine operation, so-called special military operations begin, are New Delhi and Beijing. He came to New Delhi on 6th of December for a 6-hour visit from airport to the meeting and back to airport. Less than 3 weeks before operations began in Ukraine, he was in Beijing signing a joint statement which underlines no-limit partnership between China and Russia. So China and Russia, in that sense, are in certain amount of close cooperation with. And in fact, West is now complaining that perhaps China and India are financing Putin's war in Ukraine, to which Indian Foreign Minister keeps explaining that Europe always is buying far more energy from Russia, even with the reduced numbers, and that India buys more oil from United States, even with the increased figure from Russia right now. And imagine that Russia has an old relationship with India compared to United States being a more recent friend. So in that sense, it looks like things are complex. For example, China, from initial great support to is now becoming reluctant. I think this was also underlined. India, on the other hand, is kind of becoming also far more cautious. Iran's drones are being used by Russia, is a more recent news. Or Russia is looking for help from North Korea. So let's not forget, we may love or hate Russia, or Putin is a separate matter, but he has a large number of countries with him as well. And then, of course, you could look at his friends in Africa, in Latin America, and other places. European nations also have countries which are soft on Putin. You can at least look at a dozen countries in European continent where you will find that the kind of responses are extremely soft on understanding the security concerns of President Putin over a period of time. Indian perspectives, and I need to perhaps move faster. What I have called Indian response to Ukraine is proactive neutrality, where India has constantly, and that is a standard Indian policy, you can see that in Afghanistan also. India does not wish to wait until the big sheriffs, the big leaders have begun to talk to each other and resolve issues. It wants to focus things on the ground, irrespective of whether the big top leaders are in talking terms or not. So in Afghanistan, for example, India was not talking to Pakistan for about 7 years, opened negotiations with Pakistan just for this purpose, to allow land route to send food grains to Afghanistan. Likewise, in Ukraine, India has sent about 12 consignments, including 100 tons of medicines and other equipment to Ukraine. That is continuing. At the same time, Indian leaders at all levels, Foreign Minister, Prime Minister, are constantly talking to both President Zelensky and President Putin, constantly asking them to cease violence as soon as possible. And that's a policy which China also pursues. And of course, come to talking terms and begin dialogue as soon as possible. So that kind of two-level approach is what is being followed. I call it proactive approach. India, in that sense, is also aware of compulsions. India-China relations are complex and lately tense for last 2+ years because we had a little violent face-off on the border. In that context, India pushing Russia too far is going to be counterproductive for India, because Russia would be pushed that close to China, and that's not going to be good for India's security. So therefore, India has to very clearly create that fine balance between how far it keeps nudging, pushing, convincing President Putin to stop doing things that he is doing. And the language that India has followed in doing this exercise, and I make it look like extremely dynamic. Indian neutrality becomes very dynamic because you have to only look at speeches made by Indian representatives at United Nations, or also speeches made by foreign minister or prime minister on this subject of Ukraine. The words used over a period of time are listed here. India began by saying we are very concerned with so-called special military operations in Ukraine. Next week, India moved to saying, no, we regret what is happening there. Then we said, we deplore what is happening on ground. Then we said, both countries should respect United Nations Charter. Then we expanded it to say they should respect international law. Then we moved to saying we need to protect national sovereignty for all countries. Then we moved to very specifically territorial integrity without calling names. And then, of course, when Boka massacre took place, India said in UN Security Council that India would support an independent international investigation as to what has happened on the ground. And India was usually abstaining from all UN Security Council or General Assembly resolutions on Ukraine. But on end of August, when Russia proposed that they should, on procedural grounds, disallow President Zelensky from speaking, India voted against this resolution. And then, of course, this was followed by Indian Prime Minister in the last SCO meeting in September, telling very clearly that in a bilateral meeting to Putin that this is not an era for war. And this was enormously quoted in Western media, also quoted in UN General Assembly by other speakers. So in that sense, that kind of has seen India being gradually becoming far more sharper in terms of giving its message. And of course, it has cost to India. Because long time we have seen United States and European allies are not happy with India's response, but believe me, Russia also is not happy with India's response. So sometimes when you're trying to placate both sides, it's not an easy exercise. And Indian foreign policy has moved from non-alignment to multi-alignment now, building partnership with as many sectors in as many countries as possible. And that's a very difficult exercise. Very quickly, 30 seconds more. West Asia is a great example. India is a great friend of Saudi Arabia, Iran, UAE, Israel, countries that don't see eye to eye with each other. So when United States wants to create a second Quad after Indo-Pacific Quad in West Asia, it picks up Israel and UAE, United States and India. So that is a very definitive example of success of that kind of very careful calibration that Indian foreign policy has done. But of course, it's not only having cost for India, it has cost to all of us, nations and individuals. Costs of everyday life in Canada, I'm told repeatedly, has gone up enormously. I believe some effect must have happened in the United States. And that's not an easy way to continue living with that kind of situation. 7 months of war is unusual. Nobody expected war to start, but absolutely no one expected it to continue for 7 months. Last 10 seconds extension, Donna. My understanding at this stage, you go to Tsarist Russia, you go to Soviet Russia, you go to Putin's Russia or Yeltsin's Russia. Security has always been understood historically in Russia in terms of creating buffers around its borders. So if you don't give Putin the whole of Ukraine, he will definitely take the ethnic Russian areas, the 4 areas which is already declared as part of Soviet Russia. One way to close that war, if you understand history, would be to give a face saver to President Putin. And he's not going to stop war without it. How we give that face saver, how do we explain it to Western domestic constituencies is a challenge for Western countries which are continuing with that campaign against President Putin. Thank you so much.
I want to thank all of our panelists. What a stimulating and fast trip around the world, right? Looking at how everyone is being affected by this war. We started with Latin America, which lacks consensus, no big surprise, right? But also that we have to really understand how all of the interests and the positions are being reflected around the globe. And it's so different. And what we've had help today understanding is some of the whys. Why is there such a variety of responses? There isn't an obvious one response to the war in Ukraine other than at a moral position. So we've looked at some of the propaganda. We've looked at, in Africa, food insecurity, fuel insecurity. By the time we get to the position of international theory and what's happening in India, you begin to see just how complex the response has to be as you're caught between these two giants of Russia and China, and depending on which way you go. I'm curious, I hope there are questions about saving face for Putin and how this can happen to end this war. So I'm going to open this up to discussion, and we have a question back there already. Do you have a question first?
Yes, I
We'll
do.
start with you then.
I get to ask the first question again. Yay! So my question is kind of to all of the speakers we've had today. And my question was, would it have been possible for Ukraine to resist Russian invasion utilizing nonviolent method? So instead of reacting militarily, would it have been possible to resist it through nonviolent means?
Who would like to take that question? Who would like to start?
Let me, since I come from country of Gandhi.
Thank you.
It's a difficult question to address, actually. Because violent and non-violent strategies cannot suddenly emerge out of nowhere. If Ukraine had a great tradition, let me look at you. If Ukraine had a great tradition and a strong movement already in place, well, then I think that question would require a serious consideration. But at least to my limited knowledge, I'm not aware that Ukraine has had any strong traditions of non-violent movements. And this is a contestation, I keep saying, it's primarily between United States, partially supported by NATO, and Russia. So whether the violence will happen or not happen, Ukraine had very little to say, little to do with the whole exercise. So two things. Ukraine doesn't have the strong tradition, which could have played a role. Second, I keep saying Putin. Second, Ukraine has very little to do the way things have unfolded. So I don't think that's easy to answer that question.
Is there anyone else? Dr. Maru, or? Dr. Maru?
I think I agree that the structures for nonviolence, I don't know whether they exist in the situation and with this kind of military assault, whether there will be a room to achieve the end state of getting the end state with nonviolent means. I very much doubt if it's an occupation by military force, and that this is not actually the kind we have seen in colonial, even under colonialism, where India, for example, resisted in non-violent way, but the structures were there, not as invasion at that time when the non-violence struggle happened. So neither in South Africa, for example, under apartheid, we know the kind of dialectics between non-violent and violent means of resisting those kind of systems. I very much doubt if there was a room for that kind of situation. Maybe now in the annexed areas, there is a room, in my opinion. Potentially there could be a room for non-violent movement, and it needs a lot significant peace movement in Russia. Do we have a critical mass, like I think Anna was the one who was raising this? Do we have a critical mass for peace movement in Russia? I think there were some discussions and write-ups on potential for that, but I didn't see, and I'm not, anyways, an expert on that topic. I just wanted to say these few points.
Thank you very much. I think we'll move to the next question then. Please introduce yourself.
I'm Jaden, and I had a question / comment, particularly for Dr. Maru. You mentioned how, relating to the Ukraine situation, one possible way to end it, or possibly end it, was Ukraine ceding the land to Putin, because they need, they have that historical need for a buffer, as was mentioned, and then also if you cede the land to them, that kind of gives them what they want. They have their ethnic Russians. Something I think is important to consider with that fact is think back to 1938, when it was Neville Chamberlain, I believe Mussolini, a French representative of some sort, and Adolf Hitler, who met and essentially annexed part of Czechoslovakia. And at that point, that was seen as doing the same thing. It was peaceful, and there was no conflict at that point. But as we have proven from that, the Hungary doesn't stop from that country that is aggressive. It doesn't stop. So just kind of, I guess, questioning, would there be any chance of Putin actually calming down after something like that? Or would an effort like that just be like in 1938, where it was handing the land to them only for him to go and take more and want more, and ultimately, all of Ukraine, essentially? Because looking back, in history, and as it was mentioned by speakers earlier, Putin is essentially, they have a very strong former USSR sentiment. They want their colonies back, essentially, and that's, where does that stop at for him? Thank you.
Dr. Maru?
Yeah, I mean, again, I have to do some disclaimer. I'm not an expert on Russia or Ukraine, and but from African perspective, I can say three things. First, the idea of support to Russia for annexation of Ukraine or part of Ukraine, it doesn't really rhyme a lot in terms of normative standing within the African continent. That's the first one. And secondly, it is on those countries, in those countries where they have serious constitutional governance problems, constitutional, in other words, where there is authoritarianism, or they are too fragile and they are vulnerable for coup d'etat. It's in these countries that Russia has support. So basically, it delineates, it creates a division that, unlike India, India is the largest democracy. The fact that it abstains, sometimes it startles me in many ways, because it could be an impact on generally the normative framework that we wish to be there. Now, Nigeria didn't do that. Nigeria is also the biggest democracy. It was consistent in the sense that it's not because Nigeria has never been colonized and that the idea of colonialism affecting their voting behavior in Africa doesn't hold much. There are grudges from history, people are unhappy and so on, but not to the extent that they will deny this kind of approach. That imperial type of ambition is not supported in many of the African countries and the population at large. But in those countries where you have authoritarianism, I have said, example, the Sahel region where they are facing coup d'etats, and countries like Eritrea, which are consistent and in support of anything that is anti-West, are known to be authoritarian, and their decision is to stick with Russia and most often with China also. The third element is there are situations where national interest really dictate. For example, access to food security issues. I mean, they are dire in some countries and they do affect. But I think it's a serious challenge in that regard. The only exception, like I said, like India, in my opinion, from a normative perspective, not national interest perspective, perhaps there are other factors that are taken into equation when it makes a decision of this kind, is South Africa. South Africa also had a tendency to vote, unlike most of the African countries, but also as a democracy, you would expect it would be more clearer in its position, similar to Nigeria. But in some cases, you see anomalies in terms of the voting behavior that you see with South Africa, but not on annexation, for example. Annexation and referendum on annexation is not really supported. So on the one hand, you have some countries wanting to be neutral, if you wish, where neutrality doesn't work. I mean, in this case, in my opinion, you cannot be neutral, like somebody said, you cannot be neutral between fire and fire brigade. You have to side with fire brigade. Simple. And I think in this case, it would completely be against Africa's interest, where an ambition of this kind creates this kind of havoc in Europe on sovereign state. Because Africa, like I said, thanks to the wisdom of the founders of the Organization of African Unity, said, even if these are colonial borders, artificial borders, imposed on our population and unjustly dividing community into 3-4 nations, a nation state which is alien to Africa, but we will hold this one because the solution could be the kind of medicine that we would look for could be more dangerous than the current problem that we have. And I think it is a wisdom that has served in reducing the lives that could have been lost if we were to go to adjust all borders in Africa. And imagine 55 countries. We had already 2 countries created in the past 2 decades, 2 new countries. And I think all of them are in crisis now. And so it is a practical lesson learned in Africa. And deep inside, I don't think there is a support for this. But it could play a big role because it has a voting number in the UN system and other institutions and could have influence. So a lot of work has to be done along these lines. But the West didn't step up, like I said. It has abandoned African situation, like I said. Currently, there is ongoing genocide against Tigrayans in Ethiopia. 500,000 people have been killed already. This is a report of the UN. I'm talking. Now, other estimates put it higher. So it's a big challenge that many African countries are not getting the support that they need.
Right. Thank you very much, Dr. Maru. Is there anyone else? Would you like to comment, please?
Can I just say, because he mentioned interesting analogy of fire and fire brigade, and one country should choose sides and not be neutral in a situation like this. I think that's a complex question, whether it is as simple as between fire and fire brigade. NATO has expanded eastwards 600 miles, reaching almost borders of Russia, which is not Soviet Russia, it's Russian Federation we are talking of. I just mentioned to you, Ukraine wouldn't have stood up to Russia beyond a week. So we don't know who's triggering that fire for 7 months. It's Russia alone, or is it West as well, which is supplying, helping Ukraine? So I think it's a more complex situation than a situation of between fire and fire brigade, where one side is trying to douse the fire. At this stage, neither side seems to be interested in dousing that fire. Both sides are trying to sort of showcase their firepower. And Russian side is already visibly proven to be not as potent as West-supported Ukraine is. You would remember in November last year, President Putin had actually advertised one draft agreement as to what he wants America and NATO to sign on written security guarantees. That has disappeared. He's not even talking of disallowing Ukraine to become NATO member. NATO is now talking much more aggressively of taking Ukraine as member. Ukraine has already applied for EU membership. So in that sense, not even Ukraine is the full focus. So imagine for President Putin, we all believe authoritarian leader, to begin to talk of taking security guarantees to now reducing it all the way to saying, give me these couple of kilometers of bandwidth on the border in the name of my ethnic Russian community. There is enormous shrink in the war objectives itself from Russian side. I'm not saying out of generosity to anyone, out of compulsions, of course, because he's not able to withstand that kind of onslaught that has come upon him, not just politically and in propaganda terms, but also in terms of firepower on the ground that he's facing. Russia is not even able to consolidate the 4 areas that Putin has signed a decree to say they are now part of Russia. Even those areas are under fire. So basically I'm saying is it's a more complex situation, and therefore countries have to choose their options and postures very carefully. India therefore has decided to call it a dynamic and proactive neutrality, which I showed you how the language has over a period of time changed. Mm-hmm. And India has tried to communicate to President Putin that the war must come to an end as soon as possible. And that's not something India can allow. But India, I also said, has compulsions, because we can't really ditch Russia to go into the pocket of China. And therefore, that's going to be directly counterproductive. So both in terms of principles and practice, a more complex situation like this definitely requires more complex response than simplistic response.
Yes, thank you very much. And on that note, oh, I'm sorry. Oh, please do, please.
Just to add to the round of comments, and I think I agree with the question or the assumption, the evaluation of the last comment, and I would like to add that geopolitics, peace and conflict studies, and international law are different subjects. And of course, I mean, if you analyze from the point of view of geopolitics and international law and peace and conflict studies, you will have different outcomes. But international relations needs to take all this together in order to find a solution. And what you were saying about this buffer zone, that was exactly what happened. Remember that the war started with the annexation of Crimea. And people were, okay, he needs, this buffer zone, etc. But the people who are more in geopolitical analysis and in more war analysis, they know that NATO is operating on the war scenario in the Baltic in the north. And as a result of that actions, the buffer zone that used to exist with Sweden and Finland is gone. So, I mean, if the result was to create more space for Russia, the result from the Putin's policy is absolutely the contrary. And it's a very, very complicated situation because no one wants a vacuum of power in Russia. And that's the point. I mean, China and India have been playing like, we need a solution because no one wants a vacuum of power in this very moment. So international relations is a super difficult topic that you need to put, reality and idealism and take all this element. And I really would like to congratulate again the organizers, because to have a panel with a global South perspective, playing, you in NATO, you in the United States from the global South is very, very unique in these areas of the world. So again, congratulations.
Well, we're glad to bring everyone to the table. Yes, do you have a here, use this.
Thank you so much, first of all, for this symposium and the wonderful opportunity to be listening to people and experts from all around the globe. Being an international student from India and being highly interested in the strategic and military relationships that India holds with other countries, I just had a very simple question to ask from Dr. Singh. So Dr. Singh, as we have seen in the GlobeSec Forum of 2022, when our Minister of External Affairs, Mr. Jaishankar, when actually commented by the panelist about what is the stand of India when it comes to Ukraine-Russia war, said that first thing that Europeans have to come out from the mindset that the problem of European problem is the world's problems, but the world's problems is not European problem. But then also when he was asked and commented about the Ukraine's and Russia war take from India about, you know, the export and import of oil, he also commented about, you know, that the amount of the energy transaction that Europe makes in one afternoon is equivalent to that we make in one whole month. So, but also what is happening in the line of actual control and its relation with the Ukraine-Russia war. Do you think, you know, by going through research and facts, do you think is it a time right now for India to take a side between choosing between the China axis and the US axis? Or is it India is still going to follow the same ideology of being the 5th or 6th largest economy and holding the 1/5 of the population and weighing their own side? What do you think about it?
You actually answered your question yourself. Because he quoted that two comments from Indian foreign minister, and then he in the end also cited the third comment. Right. Because this question has been up in the air, India should choose between sides. And the official Indian position has been that indeed the UN Population Department report says by this November, India will become world's largest population. And so the largest population and 5th largest economy, 3rd largest in purchasing power terms, with an enormous middle class and you know, that kind of visibility of Indian Prime Minister. I think the only answer is then that India stands on its own side. You said that yourself. So right. That's the answer being given. That, you know, of a country of this size to expect to be belonging to some pack, with due respect to all countries, and all countries have greatness among them, is little misplaced, I assume, and that is something which is not just in terms of Indian foreign minister. This whole party which is currently in power in India came to power in 2014 with a very strong argument saying that India was always sort of punching under its weight, and therefore there is time for India to now. In China you hear about Xi Jinping's new era, for example, where Deng Xiaoping's idea of hide your strength, bide your time is gone. And likewise, countries, when they achieve a certain level of economic development, and if they are of a certain size and stature, and there has to be a change in how they look at the world and how they engage the world. And that has seen India also becoming relatively far more affirmative, let me say assertive, in terms of what it thinks serves its national interest most. And you also mentioned India being the largest democracy, so leaders have to go back to voters every 5 years. So unless they are doing something useful, they'll be thrown out of power. It has happened repeatedly in India. So that explains that India is just trying to be on its own side, and therefore calibrating very carefully cost and benefit analysis as to how to keep that golden mean, which is again civilizational in India. You know, golden mean approach is a very civilizational approach in India. So that explains why this proactive neutrality or multi-alignment, which is a positive side of non-alignment, is something which is guiding Indian foreign policy now. And India has managed very well. I think West increasingly now recognizes, and so does President Putin, who publicly said he understands India's concerns, is being understood over a period of time by India's partner countries. And I think it has served India very well so far. Thank you.
You're welcome. We need to bring our best minds, keep talking, keep ourselves open, and continue to work together for solutions. I'm now going to turn it back over to Dr. Abdallah, who will conclude and wrap up. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you, Dr. Weimer, and thank you to all our great speakers for bringing this global perspective that is definitely yet added more enrichment to what we learned in the first session. We come almost to the end of this, and we would like to conclude with some remarks from our director, Dr. Zia al-Haq.
Thank you, Amar. So it's time to wrap up, and just to repeat what our panelists said about the Ukraine war and their global perspective. Please join me once again to thank them and coming to Juniata. And also thank our wonderful moderator, Dr. Dave Shang and Professor Dana Weimer for conducting this session. So the brutal war in Ukraine is a stark reminder that it's easy to start a war and difficult to manage it. And you can see the fallout. Russia even never thought that the idea was they will take out Kyiv within a weeks and then declare some kind of victory and then say negotiate a great bargain with the West to get some kind of buffer or other arrangements. We don't know. But it didn't happen, and we're at a dangerous stage of escalation. And our panelists, Dr. Anna Wahayan, explained from a very Eurasian perspective to understand the Russian stake in it and the provide explanation why Russia's obsession with Ukraine, especially their imperial vision to create the old lost Soviet empire. And Dr. Soran Singh also brought a very interesting perspective from India, how India especially navigating this complex geopolitical reality with proactive neutrality and also the tensions of the volunteers, how they're joining and changing the nature of the war, international war, especially interstate war. And also from an African perspective, Professor Mahari Marrow explained the critical dependence of fertilizers and wheat from this region that's very happening and how the complex to how the African countries kind of struggling to respond to this complex war. And also we learned from our Latin American expert, Dr. Sanch Borgo explained this, how Latin American regimes and countries see this as a kind of revival of Cold War and how that's complicated to respond to this war. And finally, we also learned one significant aspect of our, sometimes we ignore the environmental cost. Sometimes war has definitely psychological costs, material costs. And Dr. Uras from Ukraine, he explained these environmental damages, the destruction of habitat in the water, pollution, nuclear contamination in Ukraine. So, and also we learned from our Cecilia, I'm sorry, Cecilia couldn't join us today in person, but she gave a very pessimistic view of what's happening, how we abandoning, like how these stereotypes sometimes shape the relationship, demonization, somehow hurt our enemies. So we're kind of stuck in a really dark reality, like you're against us or you're with us, this sort of mentality that something doesn't help us. So I would say, unfortunately, at this stage of war, all parties seem to lock in a kind of zero-sum format. They're pursuing unilateral goals to somehow believe that they can solve this problem through military confrontation. But if you look at the history, the history always reminds us that there's no military solution, and military confrontation doesn't solve a problem. It really creates complicated things. The relative peace that we achieve through military struggle, sometimes fragile, maybe a decades, 2 decades, and after this kind of sort of revive again. So the regional war that we've seen in Europe now has the true potential to be a global conflict at some points, and it can destroy our prosperity, our collective well-being that we achieved so far in the last couple of decades. So I would say let's give peace a chance, and I hope our leaders will think about kind of being creative and also find a solution and somehow negotiate and end this conflict. With that remark, I would like to thank everybody for joining us. We'll be hosting a program like this. Please join us again. Thank you. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Dr. Zia Al-Haq, for those great concluding remarks. And before we conclude, we just have something from Caitlin and Emilia, so please come here.
So we're so grateful for our speakers for making this journey and in joining us in Zoom. It is a time out of their day, and we also want to thank the audience. Thank you so much for spending the morning with us. It is our honor to be able to host this for you. We have a small thank you for our guests. We have a small thank you being sent on its way for our guests online. But also, if you would like access to the PowerPoint presentations, all the data that was presented today and that we have online, please feel free to contact me or one of my colleagues, and we'll make sure to get that to you. Thank you so much again.
Okay, so with this, thank you so much, of everyone. Thank you for your presence, and congratulations to Juniata College, to the Baker Institute for this international symposium, which I hope is the first that we will be repeating every year, and to make it as enriching and as informative and engaging. All the best to everyone, and enjoy the rest of your weekend. Thank you. Thank you.